Between July 1942 and October 1943, in a quiet corner of occupied Poland, nearly 900,000 people were murdered in less than 16 months. Their names came from across Europe, from Warsaw, Vienna, Prague, Thessaloniki, and Berlin. Most never spent more than 2 hours alive inside the place that killed them. That place was Treblinka, one of the most efficient killing centers of the Nazi regime. It was not a camp of imprisonment or labor. It was a factory of death, built for one purpose: extermination. No long rows of barracks, no watchtowers filled with prisoners' cries, only a deceptive train station, fake ticket counters, and a path lined with flowers leading straight into gas chambers disguised as showers. Treblinka was part of Operation Reinhard, the plan to annihilate the Jewish population of occupied Poland. In this single small clearing, humanity reached one of its darkest calculations: how to murder on an industrial scale, without witnesses and without trace. When the killing stopped, the SS dismantled the entire site. They tore down every building, plowed over the mass graves, planted crops, and built a farmhouse in its place. By early 1944, Treblinka had vanished, or so they thought. Today, there is no barbed wire here, no smoke, no ruins, only quiet fields and the whisper of wind over grass. But beneath that silence lies the memory of nearly 1 million lives, and the story of those who refused to let the truth die with them. This is not just the history of a camp. It is the story of erasure and remembrance, of how humanity's attempt to bury its crime only made the ground itself remember. This is Treblinka. Blueprints of annihilation. In the winter of 1941, while snow fell softly over the German countryside, a series of meetings began to take shape that would alter the meaning of civilization itself. Germany's war still burned across Europe, yet in quiet offices, away from the thunder of artillery, men gathered around polished tables with papers and pencils in hand. They spoke of populations, transports, and quotas. Their words were sterile, administrative, yet beneath them lay a purpose that would darken history. The idea of extermination had been whispered before, but never planned. By January 1942, at a villa on Berlin's Wannsee Lake, those whispers became policy. 15 officials, representing every branch of the Nazi state, convened to coordinate what they called the final solution of the Jewish question. There were no raised voices, no oaths or blood seals. Only calm discussion. Who would be deported, which territories were cleansed, how much railway capacity would be required. Behind the bureaucratic language was the quiet certainty that the annihilation of millions could be organized as a logistical project. Operation Reinhard was born from that room. Named after Reinhard Heydrich, the SS architect of terror, it would become the central mechanism for the murder of Polish Jewry. 3 sites were chosen: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Each would exist not as concentration camps but as factories of death, places designed with a single function and no survivors. Unlike Auschwitz, which blended labor and killing, the Reinhard camps were pure efficiency. Victims would arrive, be processed, and be gone within hours. The blueprints came together not in secret castles but in ordinary offices. Civil engineers from Lublin, carpenters, railway planners, even local contractors were summoned. They were told only that the camps would handle resettlement. Some may have suspected the truth. Others preferred not to ask. The design brief was deceptively simple. The site must be close to a railway spur, hidden from main roads, surrounded by woods, and easy to build with local materials. It needed unloading ramps, a reception square, storage for confiscated goods, and chambers sealed enough to contain gas. Treblinka met every criterion. A small railway station already existed near the village, its isolation ideal. When the surveyors arrived, they noted the gentle rise of land and the density of the surrounding forest, a place where sound could die before reaching the nearest farmhouse. Construction began in the spring of 1942 under SS supervision, with local laborers paid in cigarettes and vodka. Few understood what they were building. a line of wooden barracks, a fenced-off laundry, a strange building with thick concrete walls and exhaust pipes leading from buried engines. By July 1942, Treblinka was ready. Its opening coincided with the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. The first trains rolled in carrying thousands. From the moment the wagons stopped, the design proved flawless in its cruelty. The platform was disguised as a transit station, complete with a clock painted on the wall and a sign reading Obermajdanek, transfer. The illusion of order calmed the new arrivals just long enough. Then came the separation, the stripping, the forced march down the fenced corridor the guards called the road to heaven. Within hours, silence returned and another train approached. Every detail of the camp was calibrated to maximize throughput. The layout formed a mechanical rhythm: arrival, disrobing, extermination, disposal. Diesel engines salvaged from captured Soviet tanks pumped their exhaust into sealed chambers built of brick and cement. Nearby, pits gaped in the earth, where bodies were buried in layers until the soil heaved. Even the watchtowers were positioned with mathematical precision, ensuring no blind spot where a prisoner might vanish. It was the architecture of annihilation, function without conscience. And yet, Treblinka was not merely a structure of walls and wires. It was a machine powered by people. About 25-30 SS men oversaw operations, assisted by roughly 90 Ukrainian guards trained at Treblinka. Their commandant, Irmfried Eberl, was a doctor from the Nazi euthanasia program, someone who had already learned how to kill by paperwork. Under him, the first months descended into chaos. Trains arrived faster than the camp could consume their human cargo. Bodies piled high, decomposing in the heat. The stench carried for miles. Villagers whispered of a place where the air itself had turned sweet and foul. In August 1942, Eberl was replaced by Franz Stangl, a man whose calm demeanor masked an engineer's obsession with order. He streamlined the process, widening the railway siding, expanding the chambers, and enforcing discipline among the guards. Under his rule, Treblinka achieved its horrific peak efficiency, up to 10,000 people a day. The deportation lists flowed from Warsaw, Białystok, Radom, and beyond. Entire towns vanished between sunrise and sunset. At first, Stangl saw himself as an administrator fulfilling a duty. Years later, in interviews before his trial, he would describe Treblinka as a perfectly functioning machine. To him, the murders were abstractions, movements of trains, tallies of wagons, schedules maintained. But beneath the machinery, fragments of humanity endured. Prisoners forced into labor formed secret networks. They memorized routines, smuggled scraps of food, whispered news from incoming transports. In the midst of a system built to erase identity, memory became rebellion. The camp's design reflected the Nazi mind at its most paradoxical, meticulous and delusional, combining modern engineering with medieval cruelty. The SS demanded that even the appearance of civility be maintained. Flowers were planted along paths leading to the gas chambers. A fake Red Cross flag fluttered near the so-called infirmary, a pit where the sick and wounded were shot. Deception was part of the architecture. The prisoners understood this better than anyone. They learned that beauty here was a warning. By late 1942, the machinery strained under its own success. Graves overflowed. Disease spread among the burial squads. The earth could no longer absorb the weight of death. Orders came from Berlin to exhume and burn the bodies, Sonderaction 1005. The program to erase evidence of mass murder. In Treblinka, pits were reopened and bones dragged to open-air cremation grids made of railway rails. Flames rose day and night, painting the horizon orange. Ash drifted through the forest and settled on leaves like gray snow. Villagers miles away saw the glow and did not speak of it. In this phase, Treblinka began to consume itself. The same organization that had built it now sought to erase its traces, but memory does not obey commands. The workers forced to burn the bodies counted the days, studied the guards' routines, and began to plan. Whispers of revolt spread from the sorting yards to the workshops. They watched which keys opened, which doors, which guards drank too heavily, which rifles were left unattended. Treblinka had been designed to allow no resistance, yet within its geometry, a flaw existed: human will. The blueprint of annihilation had always carried its opposite, the possibility of defiance. For every calculation meant to end life, there remained a pulse of survival. Beneath the monotony of transports and executions, a dangerous hope began to form. Prisoners dreamed of setting the camp ablaze, of escaping into the forests that ringed the horizon. The idea was madness, but so was everything around them. And so the plans continued, hidden in murmurs, etched in memory rather than paper. From an outside view, Treblinka was invisible. Allied reconnaissance never photographed it. German reports referred only to transit operations. Even many within the SS hierarchy did not know its full purpose. Its secrecy was its strength and its eventual weakness. Because the camp left so few survivors, the men who built it believed it would vanish without trace. But the earth remembers. Every shovel that turned its soil became part of a record written without ink. By early 1943, the war itself was shifting. News of German defeats in Stalingrad filtered even to the remotest posts. Among the guards, confidence faltered. Among the prisoners, whispers turned to plans. They knew they would soon be killed to conceal the evidence. The only path to survival lay through fire. Treblinka's architecture had been drawn for murder, not for war, but now it would face both. Before the uprising, before the fires, there was still the ordinary routine. The trains, the counting, the false smiles. The SS men still drank their coffee on the platform as smoke rose from the pits. They still filled out forms, sending their neat reports to Lublin and Berlin. Paperwork flowed even as blood dried on the ground. Bureaucracy was the final mask of evil, the illusion that murder could be managed. The blueprints that birthed Treblinka were drawn by human hands. They used rulers, compasses, and ink. Somewhere in those lines, in the measured spaces and labeled rooms, the unimaginable was made ordinary. A few millimeters on paper equaled thousands of lives. That was the genius and the damnation of the system. It transformed morality into geometry. When the last surveyor packed his tools and left the site in 1942, he could not have imagined that decades later, archaeologists would trace his foundations not with pride, but with sorrow. Beneath the weeds and the silent stones, the outline of Treblinka remains, a testament to what happens when precision serves cruelty. Every rail, every brick, every false flower was a note in the symphony of destruction that Europe would spend generations trying to comprehend. As the first chapter of this story closes, the camp stands completed, gleaming in the cruel order of its newness. The fences are taut, the gates aligned, the engines tested. The men in uniform walk its perimeter with satisfaction. They have built what they believe to be perfection. Yet within those fences, unseen and unrecorded, the future rebellion already stirs. The blueprints of annihilation have been drawn, but so too, unknowingly, have the blueprints of resistance. Trains of silence. By midsummer 1942, the air above the Polish plains shimmered with heat and the rumble of engines. Across the occupied territories, railway yards filled with the sound of coupling chains and whistles. Station masters checked their ledgers, SS officers their lists, and in the ghettos the word transport took on a new and dreadful meaning. It was no longer a rumor, it had become a timetable. From Warsaw, Białystok, Radom, and Lublin, sealed freight cars stood waiting on the sidings. Each bore the familiar insignia of the Reichsbahn, Germany's state railway, once a symbol of modernity, now repurposed as the arteries of death. Conductors logged the routes with bureaucratic precision. Departure time, number of wagons, estimated arrival at Treblinka first. The forms looked identical to those that carried coal or grain. Only the cargo had changed. Inside the ghettos, notices were posted on walls already covered in propaganda. Families were ordered to assemble with 20 kilograms of belongings and food for 3 days. They were told they were being resettled for labor in the East. Few believed it, yet the illusion persisted because hope was easier to bear than the unknown. Mothers packed blankets, fathers carried prayer books or family photographs, children clutched toys that would never reach another sunrise. At dawn, columns formed in the narrow streets, the shuffle of feet echoing between walls scarred with bullet holes. German police and local auxiliaries herded the people toward the waiting trains. The elderly and sick fell behind. Shots cracked without pause. The rest stumbled on, driven by the shouting of guards and the barking of dogs. When the station gates opened, they saw the boxcars, wooden cattle wagons, small square windows barred with wire, one bucket for water, another for waste. A number was chalked on each door. Order amid chaos. At 10 a.m., on 22 July 1942, the first major transport left Warsaw. 60 wagons, more than 6,000 souls. The train's logbook described its content simply as special resettlement. It passed through villages where farmers paused their work to watch, uncertain, while children waved at the ghostly procession. The shutters of the wagons hid the truth, but sometimes a hand appeared between the slats, reaching for air or for mercy. None came. For the passengers, time lost all measure. The air grew hot and foul. Thirst clawed at their throats. In darkness they whispered prayers, sang fragments of psalms, comforted the children until even whispers faded. Some scribbled notes on scraps of paper and pushed them through the cracks. "We are being taken to Treblinka. Remember us." Many of those messages were found along the tracks after the war, half erased by rain, the ink blurred but the plea unmistakable. The trains moved slowly. They waited on sidings for hours, while military convoys passed. Conductors sometimes opened the doors briefly to check the cargo counting, not helping. A few bribed guards for a bucket of water. Most were indifferent. For them, it was another assignment in a war of endless orders. The rhythm of the wheels became a dirge, the steel rails stretching toward oblivion. At the same moment, in offices hundreds of kilometers away, the machinery that sustained these journeys ticked flawlessly. In Lublin, Odilo Globoknik, head of Operation Reinhard, reviewed the reports from the camps. Efficiency charts listed the daily arrivals: Warsaw, 6000, Radom, 4500, Białystok, 3200. Each number represented a trainload of human beings compressed into statistics. The language of genocide was arithmetic. Railway dispatchers received bonuses for maintaining punctual schedules. The Reichsbahn charged the SS for third-class fares, children under 10 at half price. Payment was deducted from confiscated Jewish property, ensuring that even death generated profit. In Berlin, accountants balanced the ledgers. Not one entry was left blank. A genocide maintained by bureaucracy, fueled by timetables and invoices. Meanwhile, in the countryside, villagers learned to recognize the pattern. First, the distant whistle, then the rumble, then the smell and odor of sweat and despair that lingered long after the train had passed. Cows stopped grazing, dogs barked at the rails. Some locals crossed themselves, others turned away. The trains became part of the landscape, like storms that came without warning but always from the same direction. For those trapped within, the journey often lasted 2 or 3 days. In midsummer heat, oxygen dwindled. People fainted and fell. The living were forced to stand on the dead. When the train stopped for switching, there was no sound except the creak of metal and the soft murmur of prayer. Occasionally, a guard would open a door to fire into the car, silencing cries. Then the doors slammed shut again, sealing the darkness. At Treblinka, the railway spur curved gently through pine forest before ending at a low wooden platform. The line had been extended deliberately so that passengers could not see what awaited beyond the bend. As the first wagons rolled in, SS men in clean uniforms appeared, shouting orders rehearsed to perfection. Some carried riding crops, others rifles. Ukrainian guards blew whistles, dogs lunged on chains. The arrivals were told they would be disinfected and registered for work. Women and children to one side, men to the other. The deception was total. The platform scenes repeated endlessly that summer. Every hour, another train arrived. Every hour, the same cycle unfolded. The screams of one convoy faded as the next came into view. For the prisoners assigned to unload the trains, the repetition was unbearable. They learned to work quickly, silently, ignoring the faces that mirrored their own. When the wagons were emptied, the doors were thrown open to reveal the chaos inside. Bodies tangled, air thick with heat and horror. Workers dragged the dead aside, scrubbed the floors, sprinkled lime, and prepared for the next transport. The system left no pause for grief. By August, Treblinka's capacity had become legendary within the SS. Heinrich Himmler himself inspected the operation and demanded greater speed. Special trains were rerouted from other districts. Even Auschwitz envied the efficiency. The camp could process a convoy in under 2 hours from arrival to disposal. The phrase "train of silence" became an unofficial code among railway staff, a sardonic nod to the secrecy surrounding these movements. They carried no mail, no freight receipts, no passengers who would ever return. In the ghettos still awaiting liquidation, the rumors of Treblinka grew. Some escaped from earlier transports, leaping from moving wagons at night, returning with stories too terrible to believe. They spoke of a camp with no barracks, no labor force, only chimneys and pits. Few wanted to listen. Denial offered comfort. The transports continued. Even hope, it seemed, could be scheduled. The Germans perfected the deception. At major stations, posters displayed idyllic scenes of resettlement. New homes in the east, fertile farms, smiling workers. Prisoners were told to label their luggage carefully so it could be returned later. This instruction served a dual purpose. It kept them calm and sorted their possessions for plunder. In Treblinka's sorting area, heaps of suitcases, shoes, and spectacles rose like dunes. Gold fillings were melted, hair stuffed into sacks for mattress factories. Every train brought death, and every death brought revenue. The rhythm of the transports became hypnotic. Even the killers spoke of it as routine. "Another day, another train," wrote one SS guard in a letter home, never describing its contents. The camp commandant received timetables from the railway office each morning, marking arrivals with pencil strokes, ensuring no overlap that might cause congestion. The precision of the Reich met the chaos of human suffering, and the rails held them together. Beyond Treblinka, the network stretched across Europe. From Vienna and Paris, from Salonika and Prague, trains converged on the east. Each journey was different in distance but identical in destination. The Germans had created a geography of disappearance. Maps used by railway officials replaced city names with code numbers. To the public, the trains were invisible. Their schedules marked Geheime Reichssache, secret state matter. Yet they ran on time. Inside the moving wagons, the human experience reached its lowest point. Survivors later recalled the delirium of thirst, the oppressive heat, the cries of infants fading into silence. One remembered how the wheel's rhythm became a mantra, clack, 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 like a heartbeat that promised both life and death. Another recalled a moment of sudden rain when drops leaked through a crack in the roof, and dozens lifted their tongues to catch them. These fragments, small and personal, outlived the machinery that consumed them. Not all guards were indifferent. A few railway workers, horrified, left water barrels beside the tracks, turning away before the SS noticed. Resistance groups attempted sabotage, removing bolts, derailing wagons, or spreading word of what awaited in the east. But the system was vast, and every broken line was swiftly repaired. The trains kept coming. As autumn approached, the forests around Treblinka turned gold. The camp's smoke mixed with morning mist, and locals whispered that winter would hide the smell. Yet the transports did not slow. New ghettos were emptied. Miedzerek, Czestochowa, Białystok, entire communities erased in the space of a timetable. The SS officers recorded their success in reports adorned with stamps and signatures. To them, the efficiency was proof of victory. To the world beyond the barbed wire, it was silence. By late 1942, The German railway network faced strain from the Eastern Front. Priority shifted to troop movements, and the extermination trains were forced to share tracks with military convoys. For the first time, delays occurred. Some transports stood on sidings for days. When they finally reached Treblinka, half the passengers were dead. The SS adapted easily. Fewer survivors meant less work. Among the prisoners forced to handle the unloading, a grim awareness grew. Every train was a mirror of their own fate. They marked the days by arrivals, not dates. 10 trains, 20, 40. They could estimate the death toll by sound alone, the number of whistles, the length of silence between them. Yet even within this mechanical hell, moments of humanity flickered. A whispered prayer, a smuggled letter, a song murmured under breath. The Nazis could schedule trains, but not memory. As winter settled, the frequency of transport slowed, but not their horror. Ice formed on the rails. The wagons froze shut. Still, the orders continued. The Reichsbahn printed new timetables for 1943, the columns of figures indifferent to seasons or souls. The system was self-sustaining, blind to defeat. It would take the courage of those inside Treblinka's fences, the men and women who had seen every arrival, to finally break its rhythm. The trains that once arrived with such precision would end, as all machines do, when the human hands that fed them faltered. But in the summer of 1942, none could imagine that end. From every direction they came, the trains of silence rolling through forests, past rivers, across the heart of a continent. They carried within them the breath of millions, the last words pressed into paper, the final echoes of entire towns. When the rails cooled and the air grew still, only the whisper of wind remained. It moved through the pine trees around Treblinka, through the empty sidings and the silent fields, carrying the faint metallic scent of rust and memory. The trains were gone, but their path endured, etched into the land like a scar. And in that scar, history could still hear the rhythm. Clack, 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 a sound that once promised arrival but delivered only the silence of the grave. The road to heaven. At the far end of the siding, where the tracks dissolved into sand, the illusion of travel ended. The train doors slid open, and sunlight spilled into the wagons for the first time in days. The glare was blinding. People stumbled out, dazed, clutching bundles that had once meant security. The smell of pine trees mingled with the sharp scent of fuel. Somewhere, a whistle blew, steady and impatient. The journey that had begun in city streets now arrived at a station with no name. Guards shouted orders in German and Ukrainian. The rhythm practiced, almost bored. Their voices bounced off the wooden walls of the platform and echoed into the forest. The camp's small orchestra prisoners, forced to play, struck up a march to drown the cries. The melody was meant to calm, but it trembled with fear. Those who listened could sense it, something rehearsed too perfectly to be real. The newcomers were divided with mechanical precision. Men to the left, women and children to the right. Luggage piled quickly, suitcases labeled for destinations that did not exist. The guards barked for order. An SS officer reassured them that showers awaited beyond the fence. "Work will follow," he said in fluent Polish. "You must wash first." His tone was professional, almost courteous, as though he were managing a crowd at a railway fair. From above, Treblinka looked ordinary: fences, huts, paths traced neatly through sand. Yet its symmetry hid a cruel geometry. The camp was built in 2 zones: the reception area, visible from the platform, and the upper camp, hidden behind a tall fence woven with branches and leaves. Between them stretched a narrow, curving corridor about 100 meters long. The Germans called it der Schlag, the tube. The prisoners gave it another name, the road to heaven. It began, innocently enough, a gate, a sandy path bordered by whitewashed stones, perhaps a flower bed planted with lupins. But the fences on either side rose higher as one walked, closing like a throat. The curve of the path meant that nothing beyond could be seen. The orchestra played louder. The guards urged the groups forward, their rifles held low but ready. At the far end of the corridor stood a row of low concrete buildings with doors like garages. No one who entered returned. Those forced to work in the reception area knew what awaited. They had learned to move like shadows, collecting shoes, sorting clothing, gathering the discarded photographs that fluttered in the dust. Their task was to maintain the illusion, to keep the machinery running smoothly. Each day they greeted new arrivals. Each evening they shoveled the remains of belief. Hope had become their disguise. The deception was elaborate. Signs written in several languages directed the crowd toward baths and waiting rooms. Buckets of lime stood beside barrels of water to give the appearance of sanitation. The Germans understood that confusion prolonged control. As long as the victims believed they were still in transit, they would obey. The facade reduced resistance to a heartbeat. Behind the fences, diesel engines coughed to life. Their noise merged with the music. The wind carried the sound through the trees, a low mechanical murmur. The guards called for haste. The next train was already waiting on the line. Efficiency demanded that nothing halt the flow. In Treblinka, even death had a schedule. Among the prisoners working the platform were men who had once been teachers, merchants, rabbis, sons. They no longer had names, only tasks. Some cut hair, others cleaned wagons. Others raked the sand smooth to erase footprints. They lived one day at a time, knowing that tomorrow's transport might bring their own families. Silence became their shield, routine, their only defense against despair. A few observers, railway workers, local farmers, caught glimpses from afar. They saw smoke rising from the forest and heard the steady hum of engines. Rumors spread through nearby villages, whispers traded in markets and churches. People spoke of a camp where trains arrived full and left empty, where no letters came back. The Germans dismissed such talk as enemy propaganda, but the peasants knew the land. It did not lie. For the SS men, the procedure was a ritual of control. Each step rehearsed, each command standardized. They prided themselves on calm professionalism. A visiting officer once remarked that Treblinka was an operation of remarkable order. To him, the silence after each convoy meant success. To those inside the fences, it was the sound of the world ending repeatedly. At night, the camp changed. The music stopped, and the forest exhaled. Flames flickered through gaps in the fence. The air shimmered with heat. The labor squads worked by torchlight, dragging carts, shoveling ash, spreading sand to mask the evidence. The stars above the pine trees looked unnaturally bright, reflected in the pools of oil that stained the ground. Somewhere, an engine still idled, its rhythm steady as a heartbeat. In the barracks, the prisoners lay awake, listening to the guards' laughter from the command hut. They whispered names to keep memory alive. Some prayed, others planned. Even here, imagination survived. A man might dream of walking through an open gate, of hearing his name called once more without fear. Hope was a dangerous companion, yet impossible to banish. By early 1943, the system had reached its peak. Treblinka processed convoys almost every day. The killing center had become a routine part of the war economy. Reports to Lublin listed arrivals completed with the same tone used for shipments of machinery. The SS experimented with new methods to increase capacity, larger chambers, faster engines, more organized sorting. The camp functioned like a factory, except its product was absence. And yet, within that machinery, small acts of rebellion persisted. Workers stole moments to hide photographs, to scribble prayers on scraps of cloth, to bury keepsakes under the sand. They could not stop the process, but they could defy erasure. Each hidden object was a message to the future. We were here. We lived. Outside the camp, the world turned. German victories in the east faded into stalemates. The front line inched backward. But news from the war rarely reached Treblinka. Its geography was isolation trees on all sides, a single rail line linking it to the rest of the continent. Time moved differently there, measured not by days or months, but by trains. Among the SS, fatigue and complacency grew side by side. Some men drank heavily, others sought distraction in cruelty. Commandant Franz Stangl maintained his veneer of calm, polishing reports, enforcing order. He told visitors that the camp's efficiency proved the discipline of the German soul. But in his eyes, witnesses later said, there was something hollow, as though he already sensed that the world beyond the barbed wire would one day demand answers. Spring thawed the forest. The snow melted into mud, revealing fragments the Germans preferred to forget: charred bone, bits of fabric, a child's shoe. Workers were sent to cover them quickly to keep the illusion intact, yet the land seemed restless, refusing to stay silent. Birds nested in the watchtowers, weeds pushed through the gravel. Nature, indifferent but honest, reclaimed what the planners had tried to conceal. By then, some prisoners had survived long enough to notice patterns. They could predict the guards' shifts, the arrival of convoys, the moments when engines were most likely to stall. These observations became fragments of a plan, whispered from bunk to bunk. If they could seize weapons, if they could ignite the fuel depot, perhaps they might open the gates. The idea sounded impossible, but so had everything else in Treblinka, until it happened. For now, though, the system still held. Another train arrived, another column marched down the road to heaven. The music played, the guards shouted, the smoke rose. The repetition numbed even memory. Yet deep within the ranks of the condemned, awareness stirred. They began to see the camp not as an endless machine, but as a structure with flaws, hinges that could break, walls that could burn. The Germans sensed something too. The guards grew stricter, searches more frequent. But efficiency had bred arrogance. They believed the prisoners incapable of organization. They believed fear would last forever, and in that belief lay their mistake. By midsummer, the first sparks of revolt glimmered behind the routine. Tools disappeared from workshops, kerosene siphoned from engines, maps traced in the sand at night. The road to heaven, once the symbol of submission, became a symbol of resistance. The same path that led countless victims into silence would soon lead fire into the heart of the camp. As July 1943 approached, the rhythm of the trains slowed. The ghettos had been emptied. The machine had devoured its purpose. Fewer convoys arrived, but the camp continued to function, sustained by inertia and secrecy. The guards no longer pretended it was a transit site. Even their deception had grown tired. They played cards, listened to distant artillery from the Eastern Front, and told themselves that their work was nearly done. They were right, though not in the way they imagined. For every brick in Treblinka, for every plank of its fences, a day of reckoning had been written. It waited in the minds of the living, those who had seen the trains, the corridor, the false flowers, and refused to accept the end. Soon they would test the limits of fear. Until that moment, the camp continued its ritual. The path remained swept, the stones white, the flowers watered. New arrivals still walked between the fences, their footsteps soft in the sand. The air carried music and the hum of engines. And above it all, the sky remained blue, indifferent, infinite. When the last column of that day disappeared around the bend, the guards closed the gate and lit their cigarettes. Smoke rose lazily, mingling with the distant haze from the upper camp. The world outside the forest moved on, cities rebuilt, armies marched, nations planned futures. But here, on this small patch of earth, time was suspended, held between illusion and truth. The road to heaven lay quiet again, waiting for its next procession. Yet in the stillness, something had changed. Beneath the surface of obedience, the ground itself seemed to tremble with what was coming, a defiance born not of hope, but of necessity. And when that defiance finally erupted, Treblinka, the perfect machine, would learn that even the most careful blueprints cannot contain the will to live. The Uprising. By the summer of 1943, Treblinka had become too quiet. The trains came less often, the guards grew restless, and the sand no longer hid its secrets. The forest beyond the fences shimmered in the heat, but inside the camp, The air felt thick, charged with something unnamed. Those who worked the platforms noticed it first, the way conversations stopped when an officer approached, the way glances met for a moment too long. The rhythm of obedience had begun to slip. The prisoners who survived longest were the ones who watched without speaking. They had learned the habits of the guards, which towers were manned at noon, which Ukrainians drank too much, where the fuel was kept. From these fragments, an impossible idea began to take shape. If they could seize the armory, cut the wire, and ignite the gasoline stores, perhaps the camp itself could be torn apart. They would not escape the war, but they could destroy the place that had devoured the world. Planning was slow, hidden within routine. Orders were whispered while hauling wood, exchanged in the scrape of shovels and the clang of buckets. Each man trusted only one or two others. Every day someone disappeared, shot for stealing, for pausing too long, for no reason at all, and the planners started again with fewer voices. They learned patience. They learned silence deeper than fear. Among them were men who had once been engineers, soldiers, teachers. Their knowledge, useless in captivity, became precious. A former locksmith fashioned a key for the armory. A mechanic studied the timing of the diesel engines to predict when noise would mask a gunshot. A doctor named Julian Koronjicki offered to lead, knowing his position in the infirmary gave him freedom to move between sections of the camp. When he was discovered and chose poison over capture, others swore to continue in his name. Leadership passed to two prisoners, Zilo Bloch and Galuski, who carried the plan forward in fragments. No written notes, no meetings, only a shared understanding. On a day with no transport scheduled, when the guards were lazy from heat, the camp would rise. The chosen date was 2 August 1943. Morning broke heavy with sun, the air already trembled with heat. From the watchtowers came the usual crackle of radios, the bark of dogs. To any observer, it was an ordinary day. The workshops hummed, the laundry lines hung still, and the smell of boiled potatoes drifted from the kitchen. Yet beneath the calm, small acts of preparation unfolded. A handful of men slipped stolen pistols into toolboxes. Another group loosened the earth beneath the fence near the wood yard. Someone poured kerosene along the side of a shed and covered it with sawdust. Each action looked harmless, each gesture part of the routine. At midday, the guards retreated to the shade. Some removed their jackets, laughing, trading cigarettes. The prisoners kept working, their movements steady, unhurried. A signal, a single cry of a bird echoed once through the yard. It was the sound they had agreed upon, a noise that could pass as nature to unknowing ears. Moments later, the first shot cracked through the still air. A guard at the armory fell before he could shout, then another. The stolen key turned, the door gave way. Inside, racks of rifles gleamed in the half-light. Hands that had once built railways now grasped weapons. The first grenades changed hands like sacred objects. What followed was chaos without warning. Smoke rose from the fuel shed as fire caught the kerosene. Flames leapt, orange against the sky. Shouts collided in every language: Polish, German, Yiddish, Russian. Machine gun bursts rattled from the towers, the air filled with sand and the sharp scent of burning. Prisoners rushed the fence, hacking at it with axes, tearing it apart with their bare hands. Some crawled through gaps, their clothes shredded, their skin bleeding. Others turned their stolen guns on the guards, firing until the weapons jammed or the bullets ran out. The uprising lasted less than an hour. Yet within that hour, Treblinka's order collapsed. Fire consumed the workshops. Explosions rocked the yard. The Germans, stunned, scrambled to regroup. Some towers fell silent when their gunners were hit. Others sprayed bullets wildly into the crowd. The prisoners moved in waves, some toward the armory, others toward the perimeter, others simply running wherever there was space between the bursts of gunfire. Smoke blinded everyone equally. The camp that had been built on precision dissolved into noise. A few men reached the outer fence where the earth had been loosened days earlier. They lifted the wire and pushed through one by one. Behind them, the camp burned, black smoke climbing into the sky like a signal to a world that had looked away too long. Those who made it into the forest ran without direction, stumbling through branches and thorns. They did not know if they were free or merely outside another wall. Inside Treblinka, the rebellion faltered under the weight of numbers. The SS regrouped quickly, their machine guns sweeping the open ground. Prisoners who hesitated were cut down, others fought with shovels and tools until they were overpowered. The remaining workshops exploded as flames reached the gasoline drums. The sound rolled across the forest like thunder. By late afternoon, the uprising was over, but the camp was no longer whole. Smoke veiled the sky. Half the buildings were ash. Of the 700 prisoners who had joined the revolt, roughly half breached the fences. Only a few dozen would survive the days that followed. The rest fell to gunfire, patrols, or betrayal. Yet for those who escaped into the woods, the fire behind them meant something greater than survival. It meant the machine had broken. Treblinka, the perfect design of extermination, was wounded beyond repair. Night came quickly. The forest glowed with distant embers. The air smelled of resin and smoke. Those hiding among the trees listened to gunshots, fading one by one. They had no food, no map, only the memory of what they had destroyed. Some whispered prayers of gratitude. Others simply stared at the stars, realizing they were seeing the sky without fences for the first time in a year. Back inside the camp, the SS surveyed the wreckage with fury. Dozens of guards lay dead, towers collapsed, the armory gutted. Commandant Stangl returned days later to a landscape of ruin. He ordered immediate executions of any survivors found in hiding. For weeks, the woods echoed with sporadic gunfire as patrols combed the area. The Germans shot prisoners on sight, their anger cold and methodical. Yet even they understood what had happened. The illusion of control was gone. The revolt at Treblinka did not end the camp's function overnight, but it ended its myth. The Germans could rebuild structures, but not the certainty that obedience was absolute. Every survivor who reached the outside world carried proof that resistance had been possible. Word spread through occupied Poland, whispers of a camp in flames, of men who had fought back, of a place where the silence had been broken. In ghettos still awaiting liquidation, those whispers became fragile hope. For the prisoners who survived the escape, freedom was only the beginning of another ordeal. They hid in barns, swamps, and abandoned houses, hunted by patrols and informers. Some joined partisan units, others wandered alone for months. Many were killed before the winter. A handful lived to see the Red Army advance a year later. Their testimonies, recorded after the war, preserved the uprising in detail: the signals, the stolen key, the first shot, the wall of fire. Through their words, the uprising became a symbol not just of defiance, but of human persistence against the logic of annihilation. When the Germans realized how much damage had been done, they made a decision. Treblinka would not be rebuilt. Its function was complete, its secrecy compromised. Orders arrived from Lublin to dismantle everything, tear down the buildings, dig up the graves, plant crops where the pits had been. What began with blueprints and rail schedules would end with fields of rye. The men who survived the uprising had forced the Reich to erase its own creation. The SS worked for months to cleanse the site. Prisoners still alive were forced to shovel the ashes of their comrades, to dismantle the gas chambers brick by brick, to burn what could not be buried. They knew their labor would end in death, but they worked slowly, extending life by the hour. When the fields were finally seeded and a farmhouse built for camouflage, those last witnesses were executed in the woods. The forest reclaimed their graves, the farm stood quiet under the wind. Yet the story did not end with the silence. A year later, when Soviet troops advanced through eastern Poland, they found the ground still soft in places, the soil laced with ash. Villagers whispered that the farm was built on bones. The Red Army marked the coordinates, not knowing yet that they had stepped onto one of the largest graves in human history. For the survivors scattered across the country, the uprising remained both victory and wound. They spoke of it softly, as one speaks of a storm survived by accident. Some could still see the flames each time they closed their eyes, but they also remembered the moment the gate gave way, the rush of air, the sound of the forest welcoming them back to the world of the living. That memory was enough to carry them through the years that followed. Treblinka's uprising was small in scale compared to the vastness of the war, yet its meaning outlived empires. It proved that even in a place designed to erase humanity, humanity could still act. The men who fought there did not expect victory. They sought only to give death a witness. In doing so, they left behind the one thing the Reich could not burn: testimony. When dawn returned after the revolt, smoke still rose from the ruins. The sun caught the haze, turning it gold above the trees. Birds circled the towers, landing on twisted metal. From a distance, the forest looked peaceful again, but the ground remembered the sand-held footprints frozen in motion, as if time itself had paused mid-escape. The uprising had lasted less than an hour. Its echo endures forever, erasing the evidence. When the flames of Treblinka finally dimmed, the silence that followed was heavier than the smoke that hung in the air. The ground was blackened, the watchtowers broken silhouettes against a bruised summer sky. For days, the forest smelled of fuel, ash, and something unspoken that lingered long after the wind had shifted. The uprising had ended, but its echoes unsettled those who had once believed Treblinka to be a perfect machine. The SS returned to the camp with a new purpose: not to kill, but to erase. Their pride was wounded. Hundreds of prisoners had fled, dozens of guards were dead, and the illusion of control had cracked. The orders from Lublin and Berlin were clear: no trace must remain. Treblinka was to vanish, not merely as a place, but as a concept, as if it had never existed. The first phase of destruction began within days. The remaining prisoners, those who had not escaped or been executed after the revolt, were assembled under the shadow of the collapsed workshops. They were gaunt, exhausted, too hollow to ask what came next. SS men barked orders, their voices brittle with rage. Shovels were handed out. The men understood. They were to unearth what had already been buried. From dawn to dusk, they dug. The earth gave way with a muffled sigh, revealing the layers beneath: ash, bone, cloth, fragments of bodies that had not fully burned. The stench was unbearable. The sun baked it into the air, turning each breath into torment. Yet the work continued, hour after hour, under the whip and the rifle. This was Action 1005, the Nazi program to exhume and incinerate the dead, a last attempt to cleanse the soil of its witnesses. Railway tracks were hauled from the sidings and laid across concrete supports to form vast grates. On these, the exhumed remains were stacked wood bodies layer upon layer, doused with gasoline and set alight. The fires burned for weeks, crackling through the nights, turning bone into dust and memory into smoke. The prisoners who fed the flames were forced to crush the cooled ash with heavy mallets, grinding it into powder before scattering it back into the pits. The SS officers kept records even now: tonnage of ash moved, liters of fuel used, days required for completion. Death had become arithmetic again. They spoke in calm tones as they inspected the fires, as though overseeing construction, not cremation. To them, efficiency was the highest form of obedience, but the land would not fully yield. No matter how many times they sifted and burned, the ash remained uneven, clinging to the air like mist. In the mornings, a faint gray film settled on the branches of nearby pines, on boots, on the rifles leaning against fences. It was as if the ground itself was breathing out what they were trying to hide. When the mass graves had been emptied, attention turned to the structures. The gas chambers, those compact buildings of brick and cement, were smashed with hammers and pickaxes. Prisoners were ordered to carry the rubble to the pits and bury it deep. Timber from the barracks and fences was stripped, nails salvaged, metal parts loaded onto trucks bound for other camps. The SS moved methodically from one section to the next. The platform dismantled plank by plank. The watchtowers toppled. The guard paths leveled. Each day the camp shrank. Each night the fires glowed against the horizon, visible to villagers who whispered to one another that the Germans were burning their own crimes. Among the remaining prisoners, whispers of escape still flickered, a reflex more than a plan. They had watched too many vanish into the woods to believe survival possible. Yet hope persisted, stubborn as a weed between stones. A few made the attempt, darting into the forest during the confusion of demolition. Most were caught before nightfall, dragged back, and executed in view of the others. Their bodies, too, were burned. By October 1943, the once sprawling extermination complex had become an expanse of churned soil and ash. The SS command now moved to the second phase of erasure transformation. They brought in wagons of seed, grain, rye, barley, lupin. Under armed guard, the last work command was ordered to plant the crops in straight rows. Each line had to be perfect. The Germans watched with almost artistic precision, ensuring the pattern of agriculture disguised the geometry of murder. "Make it look ordinary," they said, and so they did. The prisoners labored quietly, knowing that each seed they pressed into the soil covered not only the ashes of the dead, but the certainty of their own fate. Some whispered prayers as they worked, others stared at the ground, unwilling to look up at the sky that had witnessed so much. The irony was unbearable that the same hands forced to build the camp were now made to bury it beneath the pretense of life. When the planting was finished, the SS imported livestock, a few goats, some chickens, and ordered a small wooden farmhouse erected at the center of the former killing zone. A Ukrainian guard and his family were installed there to tend the fields, their presence completing the disguise. From the nearby railway, a passerby would see nothing but a simple farmstead, a man in a cap leading a goat to water, a woman hanging laundry on a line, children chasing each other through the rye. The disguise was almost perfect. The air itself seemed to conspire in the illusion, carrying the scent of tilled soil instead of smoke. Only on damp days did the metallic tang return, faint but unshakable. The villagers who passed nearby spoke in low voices. They knew what had been there, though they no longer knew what to call it. For the SS, this success was both practical and symbolic. Treblinka had completed its final task, not extermination, but disappearance. The camp had devoured itself, leaving only silence in its wake. The last surviving prisoners were now a liability. They had seen too much. They were taken away in small groups under the pretense of reassignment, marched into the woods, and shot. Their graves were shallow, their names unrecorded. With their deaths, Treblinka became what it was designed to be: nothing. Winter arrived early that year. Snow drifted across the empty fields, softening the contours of the earth. The farmhouse roof sagged under the weight, its chimney releasing a thin line of smoke. From above, the landscape appeared serene, a white sheet pulled over a wound. But beneath the frozen surface lay hundreds of thousands of traces: beads, coins, buttons, fragments of bone. The Germans might have fooled the eye, but not the ground. When spring returned in 1944, the fields sprouted with green. The crops grew tall, nourished by the ashes below. Some of the SS men joked that the yield was better than any other in the district. They laughed, smoked their cigarettes, and admired the illusion they had built. None seemed to notice that certain patches refused to grow small, barren ovals where the soil, even when tilled, rejected the seed. As the Eastern Front shifted and the thunder of Soviet artillery grew nearer, the Germans abandoned the farm. The Ukrainian caretaker fled with his family. By midsummer, the farmhouse stood empty, the door swinging in the wind, chickens long gone, the fields beginning to go wild. When the Red Army arrived that July, they found no camp, no barracks, only uneven ground and a faint odor that deepened when it rained. The soldiers were told by villagers that this had once been a place where trains arrived but never departed. They walked the fields, probing the soil with bayonets, and when the blades struck something soft, they knew. But the truth of Treblinka would take months, even years, to surface fully. The Nazis had succeeded in making absence their camouflage. For the moment, though, the land stood quiet. The wind whispered through the rye. The farmhouse leaned into decay. Birds nested in the rafters where once the screams of engines filled the air. The transformation was almost complete, a field of grain above a field of ash. Yet there is a paradox in silence. It listens, it waits, it remembers. Even as the SS congratulated themselves for their thoroughness, the earth was already writing its own record, not on paper, but in strata of soot, in the chemical signatures of fire, in the scattered remnants that no plow could reach. Years later, when investigators returned, the ground gave up its testimony. Buttons engraved with names, fragments of children's teeth, metal rails fused by heat, proof that destruction cannot erase what was lived. Treblinka was gone, but Treblinka endured as echo, as evidence, as moral gravity. The Nazis had built it to be invisible. Instead, they had created the most haunting absence in history, an emptiness that spoke louder than sound, the farm of silence. When the last flames of Treblinka died out, the world around it seemed to hold its breath. The smoke that had once thickened the sky drifted away into the Polish summer, leaving behind a silence that felt unnatural, heavy, and watchful. Where barbed wire had gleamed and the scent of burning had filled the air, there was now the sound of wind in grass and the soft rustle of rye. The camp was gone. In its place, a farm appeared, a farmhouse, a patch of tilled earth, a fence, and the faint bleating of goats. To anyone passing along the road, it looked as though life had simply returned to normal. But beneath the soil, under every seed and blade, lay a different truth. The farmhouse was small and plain, built of timber once used for barracks. Its roof, patched with salvaged tin, caught the sun like a mirror. The family who lived there, a Ukrainian guard, his wife, and 2 children, had been placed by the SS to keep up appearances. They were instructed to behave as if nothing had ever happened, to tend the crops, to keep livestock, and to greet the rare traveler with a smile. The man worked the soil each morning, guiding a plow across ground that had been churned and leveled by Jewish prisoners before their execution. He did not look down for long. He knew what fed the earth that now fed his crops. At dusk, when the fields turned gold and the frogs began their low chorus, the wind sometimes shifted. It brought with it a scent that could not be mistaken, faint yet metallic, the ghost of the fires that had once consumed everything here. The farmer would pause, hand shading his eyes, and stare toward the distant woods. His wife would call him back, her voice trembling slightly, pretending not to notice how the air thickened in those moments. The children, too young to understand, would chase each other near the fence, their laughter carrying into the fields. And so the illusion continued, a life planted atop ashes. In the nearby villages, people tried to return to ordinary days. They rebuilt fences, traded in the markets, and spoke of harvests and weather. Yet everyone knew what lay a few kilometers away. They had seen the endless trains, the soldiers shouting, the smoke that had turned the sky a permanent gray. When the trains stopped coming, a strange stillness fell over the region. The absence of noise felt almost louder than what had come before. The villagers told each other that the Germans had moved the prisoners elsewhere. Some believed it, most did not. They knew that silence could be as final as death. Now and then, a German truck rumbled down the road, and men in uniforms inspected the farm. They saw the crops growing, the livestock moving about, and they nodded with satisfaction. The illusion was working. The land that had swallowed hundreds of thousands now looked harmless, productive even. To them, it was proof of success, a crime rewritten as countryside. The Ukrainian farmer kept his distance from the villagers. He would come to the market once a week, his cart loaded with grain or eggs, his eyes lowered. People watched him but rarely spoke. Some pitied him, others despised him, but most were simply afraid. They whispered that the soil near his home glowed white after rain, that no birds sang there at night. And though these were only stories, few were willing to test them. Children were warned never to wander near the woods behind the farm. Even the animals, it was said, refused to graze too close to certain patches of ground. Months passed, the seasons turned. The rye grew tall, its stalks swaying in the wind like a sea of pale gold. When the farmer cut it, he noticed how the soil beneath remained oddly soft, even after the heat of summer. The roots of the plants reached into layers that had once been fire and bone. He tried not to think about it. At night, he dreamed of trains, of wheels grinding on tracks, of faces pressed to the slats of wooden cars. He woke with his heart racing, the echo of a whistle still ringing in his ears. His wife told him it was only the wind. In winter, snow blanketed the farm. The world turned white and silent again, as if trying to erase itself. But even then, when the wind blew from the east, the smell returned. The family huddled by the stove, pretending the odor came from the chimney, from the smoke of their own fire. They lived with the memory they could not name. The children grew quieter, sensing what their parents would not say aloud. The nearby villagers carried their own uneasy silence. Some avoided the road entirely, detouring through the woods, even when it added miles to their journey. Others passed quickly, crossing themselves as they went. There were rumors that the land around Treblinka had become cursed, that at night a dull light glimmered over the fields. People said they heard cries carried by the wind, though no one dared to investigate. It was easier to believe the Germans had made something terrible and then buried it so deep that even God could not find it. In Berlin, the bureaucrats of Operation Reinhard marked Treblinka as closed. Its name vanished from correspondence, its coordinates quietly omitted from maps. Paper erased what the shovel could not. Reports spoke of reclamation, of redevelopment, of agricultural use. To read them was to enter a world where words performed murder in the past tense. And so the deception continued, not only in the soil, but in the files and offices far away, where ink covered crimes as efficiently as ash. By the spring of 1944, the front was moving. Distant thunder rolled from the East artillery, not storms, and German trucks began to move westward in greater numbers. The villagers knew what that meant. The war was turning. Yet at Treblinka, the farmhouse stood unchanged. The goats still grazed, the crops sprouted again, and the man who had once been a guard still pretended to be a farmer. He watched the convoys rumble past on the horizon and wondered whether the ground beneath him would ever stop whispering. When he plowed that spring, the soil offered up strange things. A coin here, a tooth there, fragments of bone polished, smooth by frost. He buried them again, without speaking. His wife began to refuse the vegetables grown near the old pits, claiming they tasted of smoke. One night she told him she wanted to leave, to take the children somewhere far from this land. He nodded but did not move. Where could they go? The Germans would not let them abandon the grave post. The farm had to stand as proof of normalcy until the very end. That end came quietly. One morning in early summer, the farmer woke to find his goats gone. Their pen stood open, the tracks leading toward the woods. The air felt different, heavy, charged. He could hear distant explosions, not thunder, but shells. The war was coming closer. Days later, German officers arrived, shouting orders, demanding supplies. They spoke of retreat, of regrouping, of a line that must be held farther west. When they left, they took most of the livestock and left the family alone. The farmer stood in his doorway and looked at the fields, now rippling in the wind like waves over a buried sea. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that the Germans were not coming back. In the weeks that followed, the family packed their few belongings. They loaded them onto a cart and left before dawn, the wagon creaking down the empty road. No one saw them go, and no one came to replace them. The farmhouse stood empty, its door banging softly in the wind. Weeds crept through the cracks in the path, and wildflowers began to grow where rows of rye had once stood. Nature reclaimed the surface, but not the peace. By the time Soviet forces reached the region that July, Treblinka was a ruin disguised as farmland. Soldiers passed the site without slowing, seeing only an abandoned house and fields gone to seed. The land gave away no secrets. Yet the villagers watched from afar and felt something shift. The silence that had hung over those fields for months seemed to loosen, as if the ground itself had been waiting for the right moment to speak again. When the rains came that autumn, parts of the soil sank. Pockets of air released faint odors that turned stomachs and sent the curious running. Children found odd fragments after storms, bits of glass, a small ring, something white and brittle. Their parents forbade them from keeping such things, warning that the land was dangerous. But the evidence was already rising. The disguise the Germans had built with such precision was beginning to unravel, not through human effort, but through time itself. The farmhouse leaned with the wind, until one day the roof collapsed inward. The fields, untended, turned wild. Saplings sprouted where the ash lay thickest. Birds returned, cautious at first, then in greater numbers, their calls echoing through what had once been silence. To the unknowing traveler, it looked peaceful again, a ruin blending back into the countryside. Yet to those who remembered, peace was the one thing Treblinka could never truly hold. Years later, when investigators would arrive, they would find that the land had kept its memory. Beneath the roots, beneath the seasons, beneath the silence, everything endured. But in these months, this strange, fragile interlude between destruction and discovery, Treblinka existed as both nothing and everything. A crime without a witness, a farm built on denial, a wound disguised as earth. The Germans had believed they could erase it, that crops and fences could overwrite the past. Yet the soil refused obedience. It waited, patient and still, carrying within it the echo of all it had seen. And in that waiting, the land itself became the final witness, silent, steadfast, and unforgetting. The front approaches. The silence that had settled over Treblinka was not meant to last. Beneath the stillness of the rye fields, beneath the hush that the Germans had forced upon the land, a distant rumble began to stir. It started as a faint tremor in the horizon, the kind that could be mistaken for a storm. But the villagers knew better. Those were not clouds gathering, it was the sound of war returning. By early 1944, the air in Poland had changed. It carried a kind of waiting, a pressure that no one could quite name. The Germans who once moved through the villages with confidence now did so in haste. Their uniforms creased, their eyes restless. Trucks groaned along the dirt roads, loaded with supplies and wounded men. The local police no longer held their heads high. They spoke less, looked behind more often, and carried orders sealed with fear. At the farm that had once been Treblinka, the false peace began to unravel. The Ukrainian guard who had lived there with his family grew quieter each week. He would stand outside the farmhouse in the cold mornings, staring toward the eastern horizon. Sometimes, when the wind was right, he could hear it, a low, distant thunder that rolled through the frozen earth. It was coming closer. He knew what it meant. The Red Army was advancing again, pushing the Germans westward, town by town, bridge by bridge. The Eastern Front, once far away, was creeping through the forests and fields of Poland. The war that had made Treblinka possible was now swallowing its creators. The family lived in unease. The children, once carefree, were kept indoors. The wife packed and repacked small bundles of clothing, waiting for an order that never came. Rumors trickled in from the nearby markets, villages abandoned, trains derailed, German units burning their own records before retreating. The rhythm of occupation was breaking down. The illusion of control that had once felt absolute was dissolving, leaving only uncertainty in its wake. One evening, as the sun sank behind the forest, the farmer climbed onto the roof of his house to repair a broken tile. From there, he could see for miles. The fields stretched in every direction, golden under the fading light. But far in the east, where the sky met the horizon, a faint red glow shimmered not sunset, but artillery fire. He climbed down slowly, his hands trembling. When he entered the house, he said nothing. His wife did not ask. The next morning, the first German trucks appeared. They came in a convoy, rolling through the narrow road that cut past the edge of the farm. Soldiers leaned from the sides, their faces gray with exhaustion. They stopped to water their horses and spoke in hurried whispers. One of them pointed toward the farmhouse and laughed quietly, a sound that carried more fear than humor. Then, just as quickly, they moved on, leaving only dust behind. Days later, more came, not soldiers, but officers. They inspected the property with quick, impatient eyes. They did not look at the ground. They did not linger. One of them scribbled something in a notebook, then tore the page out and burned it with a match. The flames flickered briefly and went out in the wind. That was the last time any German official came to Treblinka. The family watched as the retreat began. Military columns passed like rivers of steel, heading west, their boots pounding the frozen ground. Villagers stood at their doorways, faces pale, pretending not to stare. For the first time in years, German voices sounded uncertain. The war that had begun with shouts of victory was ending in murmurs of retreat. At night, the sound of artillery grew louder. The horizon pulsed with light. The Ukrainian farmer could not sleep. He sat by the window, smoking in silence, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like ghosts of the past. His wife begged him to leave, to take the children before it was too late. He told her they would wait until the morning. But the morning never brought clarity, only more rumors, more fear, and the sense that the world was moving without them. By spring, the Germans had withdrawn from most of the nearby towns. They left behind empty checkpoints, looted houses, and hastily buried documents. The war was unraveling faster than they could control it. Treblinka, once a meticulously kept secret, had become irrelevant to them, a ghost of an operation long finished. The orders to maintain the farm no longer mattered. The performance was over. One night, as rain swept across the fields, the family finally decided to flee. They loaded their belongings onto a small wagon, blankets, food, a few tools, and at dawn they left. The wheels left shallow tracks in the mud, leading toward the west. The farmhouse stood empty, its windows dark, its door ajar. The goats had long been slaughtered or stolen by passing troops. The crops grew untended, bending under the weight of the rain. When the storm cleared, the land looked strangely clean. The weeds shimmered with dew, and the air smelled of wet earth. No one remained to notice that parts of the ground had begun to sink shallow depressions, forming where the soil was softest. Nature was reclaiming what the Germans had tried to hide. Weeks later, Soviet forces crossed the Bug River. Their advance was relentless, a rolling tide of armor and infantry that pushed west through shattered villages and burned bridges. The sound of engines filled the air, mingled with the cries of displaced families and the clatter of hooves. When they reached the region where Treblinka had once stood, the soldiers saw little to distinguish it from the rest of the countryside. To them, it was just another cluster of fields, another farmhouse leaning against the wind. The Red Army had no orders to investigate. Their mission was to keep moving, to drive the Germans out of Poland before they could regroup. Still, some soldiers noticed the odd quiet of the place. The farm looked abandoned, its roof half collapsed, the yard overgrown with weeds. One of them, a young lieutenant, stepped off the road to have a closer look. He found the door unlatched and the interior stripped, bare only a broken chair, a dented kettle, and a child's wooden toy left behind. He lingered for a moment, uneasy, then turned away. There was no time to wonder. The front passed over Treblinka like a shadow. Tanks churned the soil, boots trampled the grass, and then it was gone, the war moving westward, leaving silence once more. But this silence was different. It was not the quiet of concealment, but the pause before discovery. The land had been disturbed again, and the past was beginning to press upward. In the villages nearby, people began to speak in low voices. They told the Soviet soldiers stories of trains that had come day and night, of smoke that had darkened the skies, of cries that had traveled on the wind. The soldiers listened, but found nothing to confirm the tales. They saw only empty fields and an abandoned house. Still, something about the place felt wrong. The earth seemed too soft, the air too heavy, the silence too deliberate. As the Red Army pushed farther west, they marked the site on their maps, just a small note, a name without explanation, Treblinka. It meant nothing to them then. There were too many ruins to count, too many atrocities to uncover. But the mark remained, a tiny seed of curiosity that would, in time, grow into the first investigation. Summer came, and with it the rains. The fields swelled and sagged, the ground shifting under the weight of water. In the hollows where the pits had once been, puddles formed, dark and stagnant. After the storms, villagers found strange objects washed up by the currents. A button, a spoon, a fragment of bone. They buried them again, quickly, afraid of what they might find if they looked too closely. The war moved on, but the land did not forget. The farmhouse decayed, its beams warping, its roof collapsing inward. The fields turned wild again, overrun with weeds and wildflowers. Birds returned, nesting in the empty windows, their calls echoing through the trees. From a distance, the place looked peaceful, almost beautiful. Yet those who passed nearby felt a chill they could not name. They said the earth here felt alive in a way that was not natural, as if it were breathing beneath the grass. By the end of 1944, the German Reich was collapsing. The Eastern Front had broken wide open, and Soviet banners flew over towns once thought untouchable. The world was changing faster than anyone could comprehend. But in that small corner of Poland, on that quiet patch of earth that had once been Treblinka, time seemed to move differently. The future pressed forward, but the ground still held the past, whispering its secrets to the wind. The farm was gone, the occupiers were gone. Even the war was moving on, yet Treblinka itself remained, not as a place one could see, but as something that lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for the day when someone would finally stop, listen, and begin to dig. The ground speaks. When the Red Army returned to the countryside east of Warsaw, they found a land that looked tired. The villages were half-burned, the bridges torn apart, the fields scattered with shell casings. But there was one place that drew attention, not because of what stood there, but because of what didn't. On their maps, it was marked only as Treblinka, a name with no annotation, no symbol, no explanation. The officers assumed it was a hamlet, perhaps a farm. Yet when they arrived, they found little more than a hollow quiet, an abandoned house, and soil that didn't behave as soil should. The farmhouse leaned crooked against the wind. Its roof had collapsed in places, and the door swung back and forth with a hollow creak. Inside, the soldiers found signs of a family long gone, a child's cup, a rusted lantern, footprints turned to dust. The yard was overgrown, the fences half buried in weeds. Nothing about it seemed remarkable at first glance. And yet, one of the soldiers noticed how uneven the ground was. The earth dipped strangely, forming shallow depressions like breaths taken and never released. They walked the fields, their boots sinking slightly into the soil. When the toe of one soldier's boot caught something hard, he bent to brush it aside. It was a fragment of bone, small, white, polished by time. He said nothing at first, assuming it was animal remains. But then there were more scattered pieces, half buried in the dirt. And farther on, the smell, faint, metallic, unforgettable, the kind of smell that turned the stomach even before the mind understood why. Word spread quickly through the nearby villages that the Russians had arrived at Treblinka. Locals came hesitantly, keeping their distance from the soldiers, pointing to the fields, to the places where the ground had sunk after the rains. They spoke in low voices, as though the air itself were listening. One old man, his hands trembling, told them that trains had once come here every day for months, always full, never empty. He said that when the wind blew from the east, the sky filled with smoke so thick that even the stars disappeared. The soldiers did not know what to believe. They had seen many horrors in their march west, burning villages, execution pits, mass graves. But here, There were no structures, no walls, no signs of what the villagers described, just an emptiness that felt too deliberate, a place that seemed to have erased itself. Still, the unease lingered. The commanding officer ordered the area examined. Men began probing the ground with their bayonets, expecting to find nothing but roots and stone, but the soil gave way too easily. In some places, it crumbled to ash. In others, the tip of the blade struck metal, or bone, or something that gave a dull, hollow sound when touched. The men looked at each other without speaking. They didn't need words to understand. They started digging. At first, only a few shovels. The ground was wet from recent rain, and the smell rose as soon as they broke the surface, thick, acrid, unmistakable. One soldier dropped his tool and stepped back, covering his mouth. Another muttered a prayer under his breath. Within minutes, they had uncovered a layer of gray ash mixed with blackened fragments. Bits of hair, pieces of cloth, buttons, teeth. The farther they dug, the clearer it became that this was not one grave, but many vast and overlapping, stretching beyond sight. The commander ordered them to stop. They filled the hole again, tamping the earth as gently as they could, as if afraid of disturbing the dead a second time. The discovery was reported up the chain of command. A few days later, investigators arrived, officers of the Soviet Military Tribunal, men accustomed to documenting what others could not bear to see. They brought notebooks, cameras, and a handful of forensic specialists. Together, they began the slow process of listening to what the ground had to say. Their first step was to map the area. They traced the outline of the railway embankment that still ran through the trees, half buried and overgrown. It led directly to the fields where the depressions lay. Following it, they found pieces of track, twisted and rusted. Farther on, the faint imprint of a siding, the place where trains had once stopped. Near the edge of the woods, they discovered charred fragments of brick and concrete, scattered like broken teeth. A few of the investigators recognized them immediately. Gas chambers, they said quietly, or what was left of them. The villagers were questioned. Some spoke willingly, others with hesitation. They told of the trains that had arrived day after day, of the cries that had carried across the fields, of the smell that had settled over the region like a shadow. One man remembered seeing flames in the night fires that never seemed to burn out. Another described soldiers forcing prisoners to dig and carry heavy loads of wood and ash. He said that after the Germans left, the ground sank where those pits had been, and no crops would grow there again. But the most important witnesses were the survivors, a handful of men who had escaped during the uprising months before the camp's destruction. They returned now with Soviet escorts, their faces drawn and pale, walking through a landscape both familiar and foreign. One of them stopped near the remains of the siding, kneeling to touch the earth. He said softly that this was where the transports had unloaded, that the cries of the arriving victims had echoed off the forest. Another pointed toward the field, describing where the barracks had stood, where the gas chambers had been disguised as showers, where the fires had burned day and night. The investigators listened in silence, taking notes, marking the ground, their shovels. Unearthed artifacts that spoke more clearly than words: coins, earrings, fragments of spectacles, children's toys. In the ash, they found the outline of railway rails laid across stones, blackened but intact. They were the remains of the cremation grates, where the bodies had been burned. The metal was brittle now, but it still bore the stains of fire. Each discovery deepened the realization that this was not a single grave, not an isolated killing site, but an entire world of death, carefully built, systematically destroyed, and now resurfacing one fragment at a time. The Soviet reports written in those days are sparse, clinical, even. They record measurements, soil samples, photographs, coordinates. But between the lines, one can feel the shock of the men who wrote them. They had seen much in this war, yet nothing that carried such a sense of deliberate erasure. Treblinka was not merely a crime, it was a crime designed to vanish. For weeks, the investigators worked in quiet determination. They photographed what they could, labeled each find, and sealed them in boxes. The villagers helped when asked, bringing water, tools, or simply standing by in silence. Some of them cried. Others crossed themselves repeatedly. The younger soldiers, hardened by battle, looked away when the smell grew too strong. By the end of autumn, the Soviets had gathered enough evidence to confirm what survivor testimonies had long suggested, that hundreds of thousands had been murdered here in the span of barely a year. The camp had been built to kill, dismantled to hide, and left to decay under a false mask of peace. The soil had preserved what men had tried to erase. When winter came, the investigators packed their notes and photographs and moved on. There were other sites to uncover, other atrocities to document. Treblinka was left once more to the snow and silence. But something had changed. It was no longer a secret. It had begun to re-enter history. In the months that followed, word of the discovery spread quietly through Poland. In the displaced persons camps, survivors began to speak the name Treblinka aloud again. It was whispered at first, then written in letters, in reports, in memoirs. Each repetition was an act of defiance, proof that what had been buried would not stay buried. The land itself seemed to echo that defiance. When the snow melted, the ground shifted again, as if breathing. Small objects rose to the surface with the thaw buttons, hairpins, a child's marble. Villagers would find them while plowing or walking their fields and place them on tree stumps, unwilling to throw them away, unable to keep them. The past was not finished with them, not yet. The Soviet documents from that year would become the first chapter in Treblinka's post-war story, though for many years they remained unread, hidden in archives and state offices. But the men who stood on that ground in 1944 would never forget what they saw. They had arrived at a place that was supposed to have vanished and found that the earth itself had remembered. And so Treblinka began to speak again, not with words, not with sound, but through the simple refusal of silence to hold. Beneath the fields, beneath the roots, beneath the weight of history, the truth was waiting, patient, enduring, and unburied. Echoes in ash. When the soldiers and investigators left Treblinka in late 1944, the silence that returned was no longer empty. It was filled with a new kind of sound, the echo of memory beginning to stir. The ground had spoken first, through its ash and fragments. Now, the task of speaking passed to those who had survived it. Only a few dozen remained men whose eyes carried both the frost of the Polish forests and the fire of the uprising that had set the camp ablaze. They were scattered across a continent in ruins, half-starved and hunted still, yet each carried within them the map of a vanished world. At first, they spoke quietly, in barns, in cellars, in the ragged refugee camps that dotted liberated Poland. Their stories were traded in whispers. One man would begin halting, uncertain, and another would finish his sentence for him. Together they pieced the memory back into shape, like rebuilding a shattered mirror. Every reflection hurt to look at, but none could turn away. They told of the trains that came day after day, of the false station, the painted clock, the guards who smiled, the tube that curved out of sight. They spoke of the voices that faded too quickly, of the smell that never faded at all, and they spoke of the August afternoon when the prisoners rose, when fire and gunfire mixed into one deafening cry, when hope, for a single hour, returned to the living. Those first retellings were not for the world's ears. They were for survival, for proof to one another that what they had endured was not madness, not nightmare, but real. The outside world, even as it celebrated liberation, was not ready to listen. It was rebuilding cities, not memories. And so the stories stayed among those who knew, passed from one survivor to another like a flame kept beneath a cupped hand. Winter 1945 brought both freedom and loss. Many survivors found that their families, their towns, even the language of their childhood had vanished. They were men without anchors. Some joined partisan groups still fighting remnants of German units. Others wandered west toward displaced persons camps under Allied control. But wherever they went, the name Treblinka followed a word that needed no translation among them. In the camps of Lübeck, Bergen-Belsen, and Feldafing, relief workers and journalists began collecting testimonies. They expected confusion, grief, maybe bitterness. What they received were descriptions so precise, so consistent, that even the interviewers fell silent. One report recorded the phrase, "They made a place where people died faster than words could be written about them." It was not exaggeration, it was simple fact. The survivors understood that remembering was now their only weapon. Each account written down, each sketch of the camp layout, each list of names preserved, these were blows struck against the silence the Nazis had tried to build. The men of Treblinka had watched their world burn to ash. Now they refused to let that ash be scattered by time. Among them was Samuel Willenberg, a young Polish Jew who had escaped through the fence during the Uprising. For months he hid in barns and fields, passing as a laborer under a false identity. When the war ended, he returned to Warsaw, haunted but alive. In the following years, he drew from memory the diagrams of the camp, the gas chambers, the undressing yard, the tube. His pencil moved with the precision of someone reconstructing a machine he had once been trapped inside. Every line was a resurrection of the dead. Others wrote, not with pens but with words that carried the rhythm of nightmares. They described the texture of the sand underfoot, the way the engines coughed before the gas filled the rooms, the sound of the shovel striking bone. They did not seek pity, they sought witnesses. In 1946, the first Polish trials began. Former guards and collaborators captured after the German retreat were brought before courts in Łomża and Siedlce. The proceedings were grim, their tone bureaucratic, but into those courtrooms walked the men who had lived through Treblinka, bringing with them the invisible weight of nearly 1 million dead. They pointed to photographs, corrected maps, recited names. Their words turned rumor into evidence, and evidence into history. Outside the courtroom, however, disbelief lingered. Even among Allied officers, some could not imagine killing on such a scale. The idea of a place designed solely for extermination defied comprehension. How could a few dozen men, armed with engines and rifles, murder hundreds of thousands in a matter of months? The survivors answered quietly, because they planned it that way. In Poland, the winter snows covered the site again, and Treblinka slept under a white shroud. Only a few wooden markers set up by local villagers hinted at what lay beneath. The Soviets had moved on to other fronts, and the world's attention turned toward Nuremberg, where the major war criminals faced judgment. But Treblinka was not mentioned there. Its commandants were missing, its buildings were gone, its name, for most, was still a whisper. For the survivors, this silence was another wound. They felt as though they had escaped only to vanish again, erased not by bullets but by forgetfulness. And so, they wrote letters to Jewish organizations, to journalists, to historians, pleading for someone to record their testimonies before they faded. Some of these letters still exist, smudged with age, written in cramped Yiddish or Polish. I was in Treblinka from the month of August 1942 until the revolt. I can tell you what I saw. Please come. A few did come. In 1947, the Central Jewish Historical Commission in Warsaw began compiling survivor reports. They gathered sketches, statements, and lists of deported communities. Slowly, painfully, Treblinka began to take shape again on paper. It was not yet public memory, but it was no longer silence. That same year, a small group of survivors returned to the site itself. They traveled by train along the same line that had once brought them to the edge of death. The rails were rusted now, the station half buried in weeds. They walked through the forest, past the clearing where the camp had stood. There was nothing, no fences, no barracks, no watchtowers. Only the faint outline of the old sidetrack and the smell of pine needles warmed by sun. They stood in a circle, said Kaddish, and placed small stones on the ground. No monument, no speeches, just silence and the wind moving through the grass that grew where their friends had died. Years later, one of them would write, "The earth seemed to breathe beneath my feet, as if it remembered more than I did." The late 1940 seconds brought new displacements. Many survivors emigrated to Israel, to the Americas, to Australia. Each carried fragments of Treblinka across oceans, retelling the story in foreign tongues. In Tel Aviv, survivors gathered in small apartments, reciting names like prayers. In New York, they spoke in community centers and basements, their voices trembling between anger and exhaustion. Every retelling was an act of rebuilding, a way to carve permanence into a history the Nazis had tried to erase. Yet even as memory spread, doubt followed it. In the post-war chaos, truth competed with fatigue. People wanted hope, not horror. Publishers hesitated to print accounts too grim for readers still counting their own dead. But the survivors persisted. They understood something that others did not, that forgetting was the final victory their enemies sought, and they would not grant it. By the early 1950 seconds, the first books appeared. Slim volumes printed on rough paper, sold quietly in Jewish communities. Their covers bore titles like "I Was at Treblinka" and "The Revolt of the Doomed." They were not polished histories, but raw testimonies, pages trembling with urgency. Through them, the dead began to have names again, and the world, slowly, began to listen. In the same decade, the physical site of Treblinka slipped between worlds. It was neither preserved nor wholly forgotten. Local farmers plowed its edges. Children played near the overgrown tracks. Sometimes the plow unearthed fragments, a ring, a shard of bone, and the work would stop for a while. Then the furrows closed again, swallowing memory in silence. But memory is a patient thing. It does not rot, it waits. In Israel, where many survivors had built new lives, Treblinka became part of the young nation's conscience. Its name was spoken in classrooms, its revolt studied by soldiers, its victims honored in prayers. For them, Treblinka was both a warning and a vow that no people should ever be led again without resistance into the machinery of death. In synagogues from Warsaw to Buenos Aires, candles were lit each year in its name, small flames trembling like the voices that had carried its story through darkness. Back in Poland, a quiet movement began to protect what was left of the site. Historians, Jewish committees, and a few sympathetic locals petitioned the government to mark it officially. But post-war politics made truth delicate. The new regime preferred to speak of fascist crimes against the Polish nation, not of the specifically Jewish destruction. So the first memorial plaques were vague, their inscriptions softened by ideology. Yet beneath those official words, the soil remained exact. It knew who lay within it. By the end of the 1950 seconds, the survivors were no longer young. Their hair had thinned, their hands shook when they spoke, but their memories remained crystalline. They had outlived the architects of Treblinka, outlived the Reich itself. What remained was testimony, their final duty. Each man and woman who sat before a journalist, a student, a court, was, in that moment, the voice of thousands. Their speech bridged two silences, the one imposed by terror and the one threatened by forgetfulness. And so, from the ashes of an erased place, a chorus began to rise. It was not loud, but it was enduring. Each story repeated, each name spoken, each grave acknowledged, turned Treblinka from a secret into a scar, visible, undeniable, permanent. The camp that was meant to disappear had found immortality in memory. The echoes continued long after the last witness left the stage. They lingered in books, in trials, in the slow march of remembrance that would one day bring the world back to those silent fields. Treblinka had been built to destroy life and erase its trace. Instead, it had become a place where memory refused to die, a quiet defiance, whispered by the living and carried by the wind over the ground that still breathed beneath their feet. The trials of silence. The war had ended, but Treblinka was not at peace. The soil lay quiet, the fields green again, Yet something beneath that calm demanded reckoning. The world had moved on to rebuild its cities, to bury its own dead, to speak of victory. But in that victory, there was no triumph, only an echo that kept asking the same question. Who will answer for Treblinka? For years, there was no answer. The commanders were ghosts. The guards had melted into the ruins of Europe, and the survivors, too few, too scattered, carried their memories like open wounds. Justice, when it came, would move slowly, haltingly, as if afraid to look directly at what had happened. In the first post-war years, trials unfolded across Poland and the Soviet Union. They were small, quiet proceedings. Local farmers who had served as sentries, railway workers who had shunted trains, policemen who had looked away. They stood before military judges in simple wooden rooms, their uniforms gone, their eyes downcast. The witnesses who faced them spoke in trembling voices, describing the same horrors over and over: the transports, the deception, the fires. Verdicts were read, sentences pronounced, but for every guard convicted, a dozen more remained unaccounted for. The machinery of death had scattered with the wind. In 1947, one such trial took place in Siedlce. A former Ukrainian auxiliary named Ivan Klat was accused of guarding the tube that led to the gas chambers. The courtroom was small, the walls bare. A survivor named Chil Rochman took the stand, his voice steady but hollow. He described the rhythm of Treblinka, the whistles, the engines, the screams, and then the silence that followed each train's arrival. When he was asked if he could identify the man before him, he paused for a long time before whispering, "I remember the boots, not the faces." The sentence came swiftly, death by hanging, but the moment brought no satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, could punish individuals, yet it could not touch the scale of what had been done. Beyond Poland, in the ruins of Germany, the great trials at Nuremberg unfolded before the eyes of the world. Cameras flashed, interpreters translated, and the architects of empire defended themselves behind polished words. Yet Treblinka was scarcely mentioned. Its commandants were missing. Its name, at that time, meant little to the prosecutors. The record of its crimes lay buried in testimonies too new, too fragile to reach the world stage. For the survivors, this silence felt like betrayal. They had survived not only the gas, the bullets, the manhunts, but also the erasure that followed. Now they watched as history took shape without them. As Auschwitz became the name spoken in every courtroom, while Treblinka, smaller, vanished. Invisible, hovered like a ghost at the edge of collective memory. But ghosts have patience, and history, even when silenced, waits. In the 1950 seconds, Europe began to turn inward again. The Cold War divided East from West, and the pursuit of Nazi war criminals became inconvenient politically and emotionally. Many of those who had served at Treblinka lived quietly under false names in Austria, Germany, even South America. They worked as mechanics, as barbers, as clerks. They married, raised families, and learned to walk past mirrors without seeing what stared back. Their neighbors never knew, or chose not to know. The past, for a time, was content to sleep, but memory is not so easily buried. In Israel, survivors gathered in circles of remembrance. They spoke the names of the camps aloud: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and demanded that justice be pursued. Jewish organizations began tracing rumors, following trails of false documents, whispers in letters, names misspelled in immigration forms. Slowly, painfully, they began to find them. One of those names was Franz Stangl, the commandant who had turned Treblinka from chaos into efficiency, a man who once described the camp as a well-functioning machine. After the war, he had escaped to Italy, then fled to Syria, and finally to Brazil, where he lived under his real name, working in a car factory. For nearly 2 decades, he was invisible until 1967, when an Austrian journalist named Gitta Sereny traced him to Sao Paulo. Her articles brought the past roaring back to life. Stangl was arrested, extradited to West Germany, and placed on trial in Düsseldorf. The proceedings began in 1970. The courtroom was modern, bright, filled with reporters and translators, but the weight inside it was ancient. Witnesses, some gray-haired, some walking with canes, took the stand and faced the man who had once commanded their deaths. They spoke not with rage, but with precision. They told him about the gas chambers, about the engines, about the roll calls where he had stood in spotless uniform while the ground trembled with the cries of the dying. Stengel listened, his expression calm, almost courteous. When asked if he knew how many people had perished under his command, he answered, "I never counted. I only had to keep the trains moving." It was a sentence that froze the courtroom. In those few words, he had revealed the moral architecture of Treblinka, the reduction of death to logistics. When the verdict came, it was life imprisonment. The court declared him guilty of the murder of at least 900,000 people. He died a year later in prison, having granted a final interview in which he admitted, almost casually, that his conscience had finally begun to stir. But by then, the survivors had already said what needed saying. The trial had not only judged a man, it had restored a name. The world began to remember. Throughout the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, other trials followed, small, scattered, but vital. Guards, drivers, engineers, administrators, men who had once been cogs in the machinery of death, were brought from quiet villages and suburban homes to face what they had fled. In Hamburg, in Munich, in Jerusalem, in Warsaw, courtrooms filled again with the echoes of Treblinka. Each testimony added another stone to the monument of truth. Each confession or denial deepened the record. For many survivors, attending these trials was an act of both courage and agony. They sat before the men, who had stripped them of names and families, and spoke of what had been done. Some trembled as they recalled the faces of children, the smell of smoke, the sound of the train doors closing. Others spoke as if reciting from memory something too practiced to feel. But in their voices, the camp lived again, not to haunt, but to testify. The trials also revealed something quieter, something harder to bear than guilt. The ordinariness of those on the stand. They were not monsters in appearance, not demons from nightmares, but men who spoke of schedules, quotas, and obedience. They defended themselves with the same refrain that they had only followed orders. And yet behind those words lay the truth that Treblinka had exposed to the world, that obedience without conscience is the most dangerous weapon of all. By the time the last of the major perpetrators were tried, the survivors were old. Their voices had grown thin, but their memories remained unblurred. Some had become educators, historians, or writers. Others lived quietly, never speaking again of what they had seen. But whether spoken or unspoken, their existence was the final judgment. They had outlived the silence that was meant to consume them. In 1986, decades after the last train had left Treblinka, a former guard named John Demjanjuk was brought to trial in Israel, accused of being Ivan the Terrible, the brutal operator of the gas chambers. The case reignited the world's attention. Survivors took the stand once more, pointing at the man across the courtroom, convinced they recognized the face of their tormentor. For months, the proceedings unfolded under global scrutiny. But as evidence mounted, doubt crept in. Documents suggested mistaken identity. Witnesses disagreed. The past blurred under the weight of years. Demjanjuk was acquitted of the specific charges, though later convicted in Germany for serving as a guard at Sobibor. The controversy left behind a complicated legacy, a reminder that time, though it heals some wounds, can cloud others. Yet through it all, the survivors' voices remained clear. They were not merely accusing a man, they were reminding the world of a place that had once vanished from its maps. By the late 20th century, the era of trials was ending. The perpetrators were dying, the witnesses aging, the paper records yellowing. But something larger had emerged, not a single verdict, but a chorus of remembrance. The law could punish individuals. History could expose the system. Only memory could restore humanity. And so, the silence that had once defined Treblinka was broken not by vengeance, but by testimony. In courtrooms, classrooms, documentaries, and books, the name re-entered the world's language of conscience. The camp that was meant to disappear became one of the Holocaust's central symbols, not for its size or its ruins, but for its absence. Treblinka had no chimneys left standing, no walls to walk between. Its evidence was buried, its traces erased, and yet it was the very act of erasure that made its truth eternal. Because when nothing remains, every word, every memory, every trial becomes sacred ground. The trials of silence had ended, but through them, Treblinka began to speak again. The stones, remember. The land had spoken, the witnesses had spoken, and at last, it was time for the stones to speak too. By the early 1960s, 2 decades had passed since the last fire died at Treblinka. The war was history now, printed in textbooks, studied in schools, recited on anniversaries, but the place itself remained adrift between worlds. The weeds had grown high, the old tracks rusted, and the villagers who lived nearby had learned to walk its edges without looking too long at the soil. There were no fences now, no signs, no memorials, just a wide meadow ringed with birch trees, peaceful, almost beautiful, and unbearably wrong. Visitors who came, mostly survivors, or their families, described the same sensation. A stillness so heavy it pressed on the lungs. The birds sang, the wind rustled through the grass, and yet underneath it all, something pulsed, a memory too vast to name. They placed stones on the ground, whispered prayers, and left. Each visit was both a pilgrimage and a protest against forgetting. The idea of a memorial began with those stones. Not officials, not governments, but survivors. They wanted a place where names could return to the land that had erased them. A place that would speak not through walls or statues, but through silence and earth. At first, the effort seemed impossible. Post-war Poland was a country rebuilding from ashes, under a government uneasy with religious memory and wary of Western attention. But history has a way of finding cracks in even the strongest walls. A small committee formed in Warsaw, historians, Jewish organizations, and a few local artists. Their task? 2. Design a monument that would honor not only the dead of Treblinka, but also the countless villages and families whose names had vanished with them. They debated for months. Should it show figures, flames, symbols of faith? In the end, they decided on something simpler, something that would let the land itself remain the speaker. The architect, Adam Haupt, visited the site alone before beginning his design. He walked the paths through the birch woods, the clearings, the places where the ground still sank. He wrote later that the earth felt alive, that the very air seemed to resist intrusion. He understood that any monument built here must not dominate, but blend. Must not claim to explain, but to endure. And so the vision took shape. A field of stone, thousands of irregular blocks rising from the soil, like gravestones without inscriptions. Each stone would represent a town, a community, a fragment of a destroyed world. Together they would form a landscape of remembrance. A sea of silence turned solid. Construction began in 1959. It was not easy work. There were no blueprints for a memorial of this kind. Local workers, many unaware of what had happened here, hauled boulders from nearby quarries. Each stone was set into the ground by hand. On some, the names of Jewish towns were carved: Warsaw, Lublin, Białystok, Częstochowa, Radom. Others were left blank for the unnamed and uncounted. No distinction was made between rich or poor, old or young. Every life lost was equal in the landscape of the dead. When the last stone was placed, there were more than 17,000 of them. From above, the field looked like a petrified sea waves frozen in mid-motion. In the center stood a single massive block, split like a wound. Upon it, carved in Hebrew and Polish, were the words, "Never again." The dedication ceremony took place on the 10th of May, 1964. Thousands came, survivors, Families, diplomats, priests, and silent onlookers. Buses lined the road. Flags fluttered in the wind. But when the crowd gathered at the edge of the stone field, no music played. No speeches could match the gravity of what stood before them. Instead, an elderly rabbi recited the Kaddish, his voice trembling, echoing through the trees. Then another voice joined him, a survivor who had escaped during the revolt, now an old man himself. He said only, "For years, they said this place did not exist. Now, even the stones will remember." The people wept quietly. No one applauded. When the ceremony ended, they did not leave quickly. They wandered among the stones, tracing the carved names with their fingers, whispering prayers to cities that no longer existed. Children placed flowers between the rocks. A mother pressed her palm against the central monolith and whispered a name that only she remembered. It was not a monument to victory. It was a covenant with the past. Over the following years, Treblinka became a destination not of tourism, but of conscience. Students came from Warsaw, scholars from abroad, families searching for traces. Each visitor walked the same paths through the field of stones, down to the rusted railway ties half buried in grass, past the marker that read, "Here was the camp." No buildings, no exhibits, no guides, only space and silence, the truest teachers. Some called it a graveyard without graves. Others called it a prayer made of stone. But for the survivors, it was something deeper, the final proof that Treblinka would not vanish again. They began to bring their children and grandchildren, telling them stories that once could only be whispered. The act of speaking became a ritual of defiance. In 1966, 2 years after the memorial's unveiling, a man named Jankiel Wiernik, one of the earliest survivors to testify about Treblinka, visited the site once more. He stood among the stones for hours, leaning on his cane. When asked how he felt, he said, "It looks nothing like it did, and yet it feels exactly the same." He turned to the horizon and added softly, "Now they will never bury us again." In the 1,970 seconds, as Holocaust remembrance began to grow worldwide, Treblinka became part of that larger chorus. Writers, artists, and filmmakers came seeking to understand how a place so empty could hold such vastness. They found that it was the emptiness itself that spoke the deliberate refusal to rebuild or reconstruct. Every absence was intentional, every silence an answer. The site changed with the seasons. In spring, wildflowers grew between the stones, splashes of color over gray. In summer, the air shimmered with heat, and the stones seemed to breathe. In autumn, leaves carpeted the paths, softening the ground, and in winter, snow blanketed everything, turning the field into a white expanse, the closest thing to peace that Treblinka would ever know. Each year, on the anniversary of the Uprising, August 2nd, survivors and their families gathered there again. Some came from across the ocean, carrying photographs, prayer books, and soil from their new homes. They stood together in silence at noon, as the wind moved through the birch trees. For a few moments, time folded the living and the dead, sharing the same breath of air. One year, a group of students from Warsaw placed candles in a line along the path where the trains once arrived. As dusk fell, the flames flickered in the wind, tracing the invisible track that had brought so many to their deaths. A survivor watching them whispered, "Now the trains go back in light." In the decades that followed, the stones endured everything: rain, frost, snow, and the slow encroachment of moss, but they never fell silent. Visitors began to notice small offerings left between them: pebbles, notes, folded prayers, even coins from faraway lands. Each one was a message. We remember. We are still here. By the late 1,970 seconds, the field had become a symbol beyond Poland. Delegations from Israel, the United States, and Western Europe came to pay tribute. Books and documentaries carried images of the stone sea across the world. For many who had never seen Treblinka, it became the face of absence, a landscape that demanded contemplation rather than explanation. In 1978, a young historian wrote after his visit, Treblinka teaches not through what it shows, but through what it withholds. It forces the visitor to supply meaning, and in doing so, to remember. That was its quiet genius. Unlike the ruins of Auschwitz, where the architecture of death still stood, Treblinka was almost nothing, and therefore everything. It was the memory of annihilation made visible through space. It was proof that even when the world tries to erase, the earth refuses to forget. As decades passed, new generations came who knew the war only from books and films. They walked the same paths, often in silence, guided not by survivors, but by their words. For them, Treblinka was both history and warning the line between civilization and abyss. Teachers told their students, "Here there are no buildings left, only memory." And memory is the most fragile monument of all. Yet the stones endured. They stood through storms, through political changes, through years when remembrance itself was questioned. They stood when few witnesses were left alive. They stood for those whose voices had been turned to dust. They stood because the world needed them to. Treblinka had once been a place built to make humans disappear. Now it was a place built to make their memory permanent. And in that transformation, history found a kind of redemption, not forgiveness, not closure, but endurance. The stones remember because someone must. They remember the trains and the silence that followed, the smoke and the wind, the courage and the despair. They remember what words cannot hold. They are not markers of the past, but sentinels of the present, reminders that even the quietest earth can speak louder than any voice. When the wind moves through them, it sounds almost like breathing, and perhaps it is, because Treblinka, once erased, is alive again in the act of remembrance, not through walls or ruins, but through the persistence of those who refuse to let silence have the final word. The echo of memory. The stones stood still, but the echoes began to travel. Through time, through language, through generations not yet born, Treblinka's silence became a sound the world could finally hear. By the 1,980 seconds, the survivors were aging. Their hair was gray, their steps slow, but their voices, when they spoke, still carried the weight of the pit, the flame, and the uprising that had shattered the camp's illusion of eternal power. They began to realize that they were the last living witnesses of a place designed to erase witnesses, and so they spoke not for themselves, but for those whose ashes still rested beneath the birch trees. They traveled to schools, community halls, and television studios. They sat beneath bright lights, their hands trembling as they adjusted microphones, their eyes half turned inward toward memory. Some spoke in bursts, words tumbling out like a dam breaking. Others paused long between sentences, letting the silence do what words could not. But all shared the same urgency. When we are gone, who will tell the story? The world, once hesitant to listen, was beginning to lean closer. Holocaust remembrance had entered the vocabulary of nations. Museums were being built, documentaries aired, conferences held, and among the names that surfaced, Auschwitz, Sobibor, Majdanek, one name began to stand once again in quiet defiance: Treblinka. Unlike the others, Treblinka could not be photographed in ruins. It existed as absence, as memory, as testimony. For filmmakers and historians, this posed a challenge and a revelation. How do you show a place that no longer exists? How do you remember what was deliberately unmade? The French filmmaker Claude Lanzmann answered those questions not with images, but with words. In his monumental 1985 documentary Shoah, he brought Treblinka back into the light through the voices of those who had seen it: survivors, villagers, even former guards. There were no reenactments, no archival footage, no dramatization. Only people standing in the present-day landscape, describing what had once stood where the grass now swayed. A railway worker pointed to an empty track and whispered, "This is where they came in." A survivor stood among the birch trees and said softly, "The forest has grown, but the ground still knows." For audiences around the world, this was a revelation. They saw that absence could speak louder than ruins. Treblinka, once forgotten, became a symbol of the unseeable, a place where the moral imagination itself was forced to look into the void. In Treblinka, the same years, new generations of writers carried the story forward. Books appeared in languages once foreign to its soil: English, French, Hebrew, Spanish. Some were histories, precise and factual. Others were memoirs, written decades after the events but still trembling with immediacy. And some were novels, blending memory and imagination to bridge the gap between knowing and feeling. Among them, one book stood out. Jean-François Steiner's Treblinka, 1966, translated widely in the 1970 seconds. Though written in a hybrid style, part history, part reconstructed dialogue, it captured something elemental: the uprising, the dignity of the doomed, and the impossible courage of those who had refused to die in silence. For readers who had never heard the camp's name, it became a first introduction, a doorway to truth. It made Treblinka not only a site of death, but also a symbol of revolt, a spark in the darkest night. In classrooms, the name began to appear in textbooks, in lectures, in films. Students traced its outlines on maps of Poland, puzzled at how a place so small could have swallowed so many lives. Teachers struggled to explain its scale, its speed, its secrecy, but when they showed photographs of the stone memorial, the students understood. The absence itself was the evidence. In Israel, school trips to Poland began, including Treblinka, alongside Auschwitz and Majdanek. Young Israelis stood among the stones, listening to guides recount the stories of the transports, the deception, and the revolt. Some wept, some stood silent, gazing at the field that stretched before them, trying to imagine a sky filled with smoke where now only sunlight filtered through trees. Many wrote afterward that it was Treblinka, not Auschwitz, that haunted them most, because here nothing remained, and that nothing was everything. For the survivors who accompanied these groups, the experience was bittersweet. They were relieved to see remembrance growing, yet they knew that soon the task would pass entirely to others. One man, after finishing his final visit, told a student beside him, "When I die, don't tell my story as tragedy. Tell it as warning. Treblinka is what happens when people look away." By the late 20th century, remembrance had become both a duty and a discipline. Archivists collected testimonies, digitized photographs, mapped train schedules, and cataloged fragments of evidence still being unearthed. Historians cross-referenced German railway documents with survivor sketches, building a detailed timeline of the camp's operation from its opening in July 1942 to its final dismantling in late 1943. Archaeologists began using ground-penetrating radar and non-invasive surveys to identify the exact locations of the mass graves and cremation pits. They confirmed what the witnesses had long said: the Nazis had not destroyed everything. Beneath the soil, the truth remained intact. In 2007, a British forensic archaeologist, Caroline Sturdy-Coles, conducted one of the most thorough modern studies of Treblinka. Her team mapped the camp's boundaries, traced the outlines of the gas chambers, and documented hundreds of artifacts, coins, jewelry, keys, fragments of tile once used to disguise the killing rooms as bathhouses. Every discovery, though small, carried enormous weight. Each object was a voice returned to history. The findings silenced the last remnants of denial that had clung to Treblinka's story in extremist corners of the world. Science, at last, had met memory, and memory had been right all along. But the greater victory was not forensic, it was human, because through the decades, the story of Treblinka had become not just a Jewish tragedy, nor even a European one, but a universal warning. It spoke of how swiftly civilization could collapse when conscience falters, how silence itself can become an accomplice. In classrooms from Tel Aviv to Toronto, from Warsaw to Washington, Treblinka was taught not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror held up to the present. It asked not, "What happened?" but, "Could it happen again?" Writers and artists continued to respond. Painters created vast canvases of gray and rust, Composers wrote requiems, poets described the wind over the stones. Some works were abstract, others deeply personal. Yet all shared a single purpose: to keep the silence alive, but never empty, to transform horror into remembrance and remembrance into moral clarity. Meanwhile, the descendants of survivors, children, and grandchildren began to take up the mantle. They recorded their families' testimonies, built digital archives, led memorial tours. Some changed careers to become historians or educators. One grandson of a Treblinka survivor wrote, "I never knew my grandfather's voice, but when I stand there, in the wind, I hear him." The memorial itself evolved. Paths were added to guide visitors gently through the landscape without disturbing the soil. Informational plaques appeared, describing the history in multiple languages, but sparingly so as not to drown out the silence. Every addition was careful, reverent. Treblinka remained what it had become, a place that spoke softly, but with infinite authority. Visitors often described the same strange feeling, that the land was watching them. The rustle of leaves seemed to carry whispers. The shifting light over the stones felt like memory itself moving. Some said they felt peace, others said they felt judged. Both were true. For Poland, Treblinka remained a wound and a duty. Local schools began holding remembrance ceremonies each year, not under political banners, but under the simple words, "Nigdy więcej," never again. The site's caretakers tended it quietly, raking leaves, repainting plaques, guiding foreign visitors who came seeking something they could not name. They understood that their task was not only to preserve a starred place, but to protect a silence that contained more truth than most words could hold. By the dawn of the 21st century, Treblinka was no longer just a site, it had become a symbol of the human conscience itself. In books, films, and education programs around the world, it stood for the idea that remembrance is not about the past, it is about vigilance. When school children learn its story, when travelers stand in that clearing, when an old survivor's recording plays in a museum halfway across the world, Treblinka lives again not in horror, but in warning. And yet, for all the preservation and ceremony, Treblinka remains elusive. Those who visit often leave with more questions than answers. How could human hands build such a place? How could the world stand by for so long? And how can we live with the knowledge that it happened? The stones do not answer. They simply stand, as they have stood for 60 years, patient and enduring. Their silence is not indifference, it is understanding. They know that memory cannot prevent cruelty, but it can expose it, name it, refuse to let it hide. They know that forgetting is the first step toward repetition. And they know that as long as the wind moves among them, Treblinka will never truly disappear again. Each year, when the sun sets on the anniversary of the uprising, candles are lit among the stones. The flames flicker against the twilight, their glow small but unyielding. Visitors stand in a circle, some praying, others silent. The air cools, the shadows lengthen, and for a moment, it seems as though the voices of the past rise once more from beneath the soil, not in agony, but in remembrance. They whisper to the living, "Remember us," not as ashes, but as warning, not as victims, but as voices that still speak. Treblinka no longer exists on any map, but it lives in the world's moral geography, a point of compass by which we measure humanity itself. It is a place where the Doppelspur, earth breathes history, where silence testifies louder than speech, and where memory fragile, luminous, unending keeps the dead alive in the conscience of the living. Guardians of the soil, the world around Treblinka has changed. The forests that once hid the rails have grown tall again, the roads are paved, and the rivers run quietly beneath bridges rebuilt for a modern Poland. Yet inside that fenced clearing beyond the birch line, time moves differently. The air feels heavier, as if it still remembers every breath ever taken there. Those who come to tend this place call themselves guardians, not out of pride but of duty. They sweep the paths, clear the moss from stone, replace the wooden signs weathered by rain. They are historians, archivists, groundskeepers, and volunteers. Some are descendants of survivors. Others are locals who grew up hearing whispers from their grandparents' tales half spoken about the field where trains once came and never left. They know this soil better than anyone. They know where it dips slightly, where the grass grows differently because of what lies beneath. They know which stone marks which vanished town. They know that every gust of wind carries dust that was once part of someone's story. At dawn, before the first visitors arrive, the guardians walk the paths alone. The light filters through the trees in thin gold ribbons, glancing off the granite faces. Birds call in the distance. The world looks ordinary until you remember where you are. They pause often, listening, not to the forest, but to what lies beneath it. The ground speaks in ways only patience can hear, a whisper of memory, a soft resistance beneath the shovel, a scent that rises after the rain. Every few years, teams of archaeologists arrive, careful, methodical, reverent. They do not dig deep, they cannot. The soil is sacred. Instead, they use instruments, scanners, radar, drones, tools that read the language of the earth without breaking its surface. Their screens light up with images of what lies hidden, patterns of graves, faint outlines of structures long erased. They map them quietly, recording each coordinate with precision, knowing that every measurement is a dialogue with ghosts. One of them, a woman in her 30s, once said during an interview, "We don't excavate Treblinka, we listen to it." Her words became almost a motto among those who worked here. Listening, not unearthing, bearing witness without disturbance. The discoveries they make are small but immeasurable in weight. A child's shoe buckle, a rusted key, a coin blackened with age. Each artifact, no larger than a palm, carries an entire life folded inside it. When catalogued, photographed, and returned to the soil, they become both found and reburied, a ritual of remembrance and respect. Some visitors ask why the camp is not rebuilt, why there are no replicas, no reconstructions. The guides always answer the same way, because Treblinka is not a museum, it is a graveyard. To rebuild it would be to misunderstand it. Its emptiness is its truth, its silence is its voice. The guardians spend their days guiding quiet groups, students from Europe, tourists from across the ocean, sometimes families searching for the names of lost relatives. They tell the story not as spectacle but as prayer. They speak of the trains, of the deception, of the revolt. They point to the open field and say, "This was the gas chamber area," or "Here was the railway ramp." But there is nothing to see, and that is the point. The imagination must work harder here. And in doing so, it remembers more deeply. On certain days, the guardians find offerings left behind: small stones, candles, folded notes. One morning, a keeper found a violin string coiled neatly atop a stone marked Warzawa. No one knew who had placed it there, but it stayed. Another time, a child's drawing was tucked between two rocks, a field of flowers and a single line of text for the ones who couldn't grow up. These gestures, simple as they are, turn the memorial into a living conversation across generations. As evening falls, the guardians lock the gate and make one last walk along the perimeter. The air cools, shadows stretch long between the stones. They stop at the main monument, lay a hand against its rough surface, and whisper goodnight. Then they leave, knowing that even in their absence, the stones will keep watch. Each season brings a new rhythm. In spring, wildflowers push through the gravel, bright and defiant. In summer, the heat rises from the ground in shimmering waves, and the air hums with insects. Autumn paints the trees in gold and rust, scattering leaves that blanket the stones like offerings. And in winter, the snow returns white, weightless, merciful. The field becomes still, almost pure. The only footprints are those of deer and caretakers. The guardians say winter is when Treblinka breathes most softly. The cold mutes everything, and the silence feels less like sorrow and more like rest. Sometimes, on those short gray afternoons, the curator lights a single candle inside the small museum, building the one that holds photographs, testimonies, and a scale model of the camp. The flame flickers against the glass cases, illuminating faces that stare out from decades past. She says it reminds her that remembrance is a form of warmth. Over the years, scholars and pilgrims alike have come to see the Guardians themselves as part of the memorial living extensions of its memory. Their work is not dramatic. It is patient, repetitive, humble. They weed, polish, document, translate. They write reports, host ceremonies, and answer the same difficult questions again and again. And in doing so, they keep the dialogue between the dead and the living alive. In 2013, the Treblinka Museum was expanded not as a grand structure, but as a quiet annex, nestled near the entrance. Its walls are pale concrete, its windows narrow, letting in only enough light to touch the displays without disturbing them. Inside are artifacts recovered from the site, copies of documents, testimonies, and films of the survivors who once returned here. Visitors enter in silence and leave the same way. The museum is not meant to explain Treblinka. It is meant to prepare the visitor to face its silence outside. One exhibit features a simple looped recording, the sound of wind over the field, captured on different days of the year. No narration, no music, just the wind. Visitors often stand before it longer than they expect, realizing that the sound they hear is the same one that moves through the stones outside, the same sound that once carried the train's whistles, the cries, the silence after. It is the voice of continuity. The Guardians often speak of Treblinka not as a place of death, but as a teacher without words, whose lessons must be felt rather than told. They know the generations visiting now are far removed from those who lived through the war. To them, the challenge is to make the abstract personal again. So they tell the story through objects, through soil, through the simple act of standing still. Sometimes, when a young visitor asks why this happened, the Guardians pause for a long moment. They do not answer with history or politics. They say softly, because people forgot to see each other as human. Then they let the silence finish the lesson. Beyond the site, Treblinka's story continues to shape lives. Digital projects now archive every testimony, every photograph, every known transport list. Universities collaborate with the museum to reconstruct the camp in virtual space, not for spectacle, but for education, allowing people across the world to walk its paths in remembrance. In that digital landscape, the stones are rendered one by one, their cracks and shadows preserved with care. Even in virtual form, the silence remains. The Guardians have begun training the next generation, young historians, guides, and volunteers. They teach them not only dates and facts, but tone, restraint, empathy. They say, "You are not telling a story of death, you are carrying voices." They remind them that to speak of Treblinka is not to perform, but to honor, and that the truest act of remembrance is not to stand in mourning forever, but to live differently because of what one has learned. Every August 2nd, they gather for the annual commemoration of the Uprising. Candles line the path. Survivors' families stand beside diplomats and students. The Guardians move quietly among them, ensuring every flame stays lit against the wind. When the speeches end, when the crowd falls silent, the curator steps forward and says the same words each year. This ground once swallowed voices. Today, it gives them back. And the crowd answers not with applause, but with stillness. At night, after everyone leaves, the Guardians return once more. The candles flicker among the stones, like stars scattered across the earth. They look out over the field and see what the SS once tried to erase, not despair, but endurance. Not absence, but presence. The kind of presence that cannot be destroyed because it no longer depends on walls or bodies, only on memory and will. The Guardians understand something few others can, that Treblinka is not only a site of tragedy, but a covenant. It binds the living to the dead through vigilance. It demands that we remember not only what was lost, but what must never be repeated. And so they keep watch, day after day, season after season, knowing that the stones depend on them only as much as humanity depends on its memory. When the last light fades and the gate is locked, the field returns to silence. The wind rises, brushing through the birch leaves, carrying the faint scent of soil and pine. Somewhere far away, a train passes on a modern track, its sound softened by distance. To the Guardians, it is not a reminder of horror but of continuity, that life goes on, and with it, the duty to remember. And as the stars appear above the dark forest, Treblinka breathes again, not in fear, but in peace. Because as long as there are hands to tend it and hearts to listen, the soil will never fall silent. The Guardians of Treblinka stand watch for all of us, keepers of a silence that teaches, warns, and endures beyond time itself. The last witnesses' time, once frozen in the fields of Treblinka, began to move again. The world aged, cities changed, borders shifted, but the voices of those who had stood inside the fences remained caught between past and present. They were the last ones who could say, "I was there." For decades, they had carried that sentence like a burden and a blessing. Some had spoken early, when the memories were still raw and the world still doubtful. Others had remained silent for half a lifetime, unable to bridge the chasm between what they had seen and what ordinary life demanded of them. But as the century turned, the silence broke one final time. The survivors felt the years pressing against them. Their hands trembled, their eyes clouded, yet their determination sharpened. They knew they were the last witnesses, the final breath of living testimony before memory became history. Recording studios, archives, and classrooms opened their doors to them. In Israel, Poland, the United States, and beyond, cameras flickered on, and voices that had once whispered now spoke aloud. Each survivor sat in front of the lens as if facing an invisible court of time. They spoke slowly, choosing words with care, as if to place each one like a stone on a grave. No script, no rehearsal, only the truth, unadorned and human. Their stories were not identical. Some began with childhood, with streets of laughter, bread, lines, and candlelight before the war. Others began at the station, with the sound of the train door slamming shut. Each voice built another piece of the mosaic that the Nazis had tried to shatter. One man described the gas chambers not as buildings, but as rooms without air. A woman recalled the smell of pine needles in the path that led to death, and how she tried to fix that scent in her mind, the last thing of nature she would ever see before stepping inside. Another survivor spoke not of horror, but of one fleeting moment of humanity, a guard turning away so that a mother could kiss her child goodbye. Their testimonies were not only accounts of death, they were confessions of life. Archivists called these recordings time capsules of conscience. They knew that one day the voices would no longer speak in the present tense, that generations would meet them only through screens. To listen was to feel history breathing through static, the past made intimate, again, through trembling lips and unfinished sentences. Some interviews lasted hours, some days. The survivors never asked for rest. They wanted to leave everything behind, every face, every name, every breath stolen by the smoke. One survivor, Samuel Willenberg, the last known participant of the August 1943 uprising, became a sculptor in Israel. He shaped clay with the same hands that had once torn fences. His figures were tall, angular, caught in motion, men and women mid-escape, frozen between despair and hope. When asked why he sculpted Treblinka again and again, he said, "Because I cannot rebuild it. I can only give shape to what refuses to die in me." His art became testimony in 3 dimensions, each statue a continuation of his voice. He lived to see his work displayed in museums and classrooms across the world, his story woven into the fabric of remembrance before his death in 2016. Others found different ways to pass the torch. Some wrote memoirs, not polished literature, but raw memory, set down before time erased the details. A few recorded lullabies and songs remembered from the camp's laborers. Melodies hummed quietly to drown out the screams. One woman, who had been a child at deportation, sang a tune her mother had whispered to her in the train car. When the recording ended, she said softly, Now she will live as long as this tape does. The digital age gave the witnesses a new kind of immortality. Archives like the USC Shoah Foundation collected thousands of hours of testimony, storing them in databases that could outlast any monument. Researchers developed interactive programs allowing future students to converse with holographic projections of survivors, not illusions, but living repositories of memory coded into light. It was strange, even sacred, the dead preparing to speak to the unborn. When a student asked one of these holograms, "Do you still have nightmares?" the recorded voice answered, after a pause, "Only when people forget." For the survivors still living, each year became a farewell tour. They traveled tirelessly to Poland, to Israel, to America, to Germany itself. They stood before crowds of teenagers, heads bent in attention, and told their stories once more. Some spoke in auditoriums, others at the edge of the stone field in Treblinka. The guardians would stand beside them, steadying their arms when they walked on the uneven ground. One elderly man pressed his cane into the soil and whispered, "I planted this memory here, now it's yours." Gradually, the roll call of voices thinned. Obituaries appeared quietly, one after another, each one carrying the same phrase, "The last survivor of Treblinka's uprising." With each passing year, the line between living memory and recorded history blurred a little more. Yet even as the witnesses faded, their words grew stronger, copied, translated, shared across the world. In classrooms, students listened to their testimonies through headphones, eyes wide, as if time itself had folded to speak directly to them. Historians noticed something profound in these final testimonies. The survivors no longer spoke only of death. They spoke of legacy, of how to live after Treblinka. They urged forgiveness without forgetting, hope without illusion. They said humanity must learn not to look away from suffering, that indifference is the first step toward complicity. One woman, near her end, said, "When I was young, I wanted revenge. Now I want listeners." She smiled faintly. Listeners are the best revenge against silence. Their passing transformed Treblinka once again. The memorial no longer received visitors who came to meet witnesses, it received those who came to inherit them. Students placed photos of survivors beside candles during ceremonies. Their faces, once flesh, now light, shone from screens and walls. The dead had become teachers, their lessons preserved in circuits and sound waves. The guardians noticed the change too. They felt it in the way visitors lingered longer at the museum's video room, how they stood still when a survivor's voice filled the speakers. It was as if the field outside had found a new echo, the echo of recorded remembrance, a conversation between centuries. One curator said, "The survivors taught us how to listen, now it's our turn to answer." In the twilight of living memory, Treblinka reached a strange kind of peace. The site no longer demanded explanation, it simply was. Its meaning lived now in the voices that hovered between the living and the gone. Each testimony was a bridge, each listener a guardian of that bridge. Together they formed an unbroken chain, fragile, yes, but unyielding. When the final known survivor passed away, newspapers carried the headline, "The last witness of Treblinka has died." But the truth was more complicated. He had not died alone. His words remained in books, in recordings, in hearts that had heard him speak. And as long as those words were heard, the witness still lived. At Treblinka, a ceremony was held in his honor. The guardians lit candles, the ambassador of Israel placed a wreath, and a child read aloud a passage from his testimony. "We must speak not of numbers, but of names, because evil counts in thousands, but love remembers in one." The wind moved through the birches, carrying the boy's voice across the stones. It sounded, for an instant, as though Treblinka itself was answering. Today, the recordings of the survivors play in museums and classrooms every day. They have become part of the world's rhythm, a quiet chorus against amnesia. Their words remind us that memory is not about holding on to pain, but about preventing its return. They remind us that history is not behind us, but beneath our feet, waiting for us to walk wisely upon it. The last witnesses are gone, but they left the world a promise that as long as people speak their names, the silence will never win. Treblinka's soil holds their ashes, the world holds their echo, and in that echo lies our greatest inheritance, the sound of truth refusing to die. The eternal silence, the birch leaves stir, the wind sighs, and Treblinka breathes once more. No smoke, no shouting, no trains, only the steady rhythm of the earth reclaiming itself. Where once the rails screamed, wildflowers now nod their heads. Where once men built fences to divide life from death, there are only shadows and sunlight weaving together without borders. This is how the world remembers, not through monuments of power, but through quiet endurance. The silence here is not empty. It is full of names, of faces, of echoes that rise whenever the wind crosses the field. For those who come here, the first sound is always the same. Footsteps on gravel, the crunch that breaks the hush. Then, gradually, the silence grows, louder than any noise they've known. It presses gently against the chest, asking nothing, demanding everything. And if they stand long enough, the silence begins to speak. It tells of trains that came at dawn, of smoke that hid the stars, of people who believed the lie that they were being sent to work. It tells of the guards who followed orders, the neighbors who looked away, the prisoners who rose up with nothing but courage and stones. It tells of how an empire of cruelty tried to erase its own crimes and failed. Because the soil remembers. The ground beneath the visitor's feet is layered like pages. Beneath the grass lies ash. Beneath the ash lie bones. Beneath the bones lie fragments of the human soul, the longing to live, to be remembered. Every breeze that moves through the pines is a turning page of that buried book. People often ask what they should feel here. Grief, anger, pity, but the truth is simpler. Treblinka asks only one thing: attention. To stand and listen. To understand that history does not end when the killing stops, it ends when we stop listening. At sunset, the stones cast long shadows like lines of an unwritten poem. Each one bears the name of a town: Warsaw, Lublin, Thessaloniki, Vienna, names that once rang with laughter, markets, lullabies. Now they rest in stone silence, but not in defeat. They have been given back their dignity. When the last rays of light fall across the memorial, the field glows gold. It is beautiful, unbearably so, and that beauty is part of the lesson. Evil tried to make this place ugly forever. But time, patient and merciful, turned it into a garden of remembrance, not to soften what happened, but to remind us that life, even scorched to ashes, can grow again. Some evenings, when the guardians finish their rounds, they sit on the low wall near the entrance and watch the forest darken. They do not speak much. They don't need to. They know that their presence itself, their breathing, their waiting, is part of the testimony. Every generation that keeps this place alive becomes one more link in a chain that stretches backward into fire and forward into light. Beyond Poland's borders, the story continues. In classrooms across the world, students open history books and trace the small dot labeled Treblinka. It looks insignificant, a speck among rivers and cities. Yet, inside that dot lives the measure of civilization itself. It asks every reader the same question: what will you do with your silence? Because silence is not only what happens after tragedy, it is what allows tragedy to begin. It is the shrug, the turning away, the comfort that mistakes distance for innocence. Treblinka warns us that evil does not start with hatred, it starts with forgetting. And so, the eternal silence of this place is not passive. It is active resistance against oblivion. It stands as a reminder that memory is not a burden, it is armor. Each name spoken, each story told, each candle lit becomes a shield against repetition. When visitors leave, they often walk back down the path slower than they arrived. Some carry stones in their hands to place on the memorial. Others take nothing, afraid to disturb the air. But all carry something unseen, a quiet change that travels with them into the world beyond the forest. They will hear a train whistle one day and pause. They will see smoke in the distance and remember. They will hear an argument about history, about truth, about denial, and they will know which side to stand on. In that way, Treblinka continues to shape the conscience of the world, long after its last witness has gone. It teaches that remembrance is not nostalgia, it is responsibility. It teaches that evil can be organized, calculated, efficient, and therefore must be met not with equal cruelty, but with unwavering humanity. It teaches that compassion, too, can be a system one built in homes, schools, communities, and hearts. There are no guards here anymore. Only the birches, the grass, the guardians who sweep the paths. But if one listens closely, there is still a rhythm not of boots, but of breathing. The breath of the living mingling with the breath of the dead. Together they form the pulse of memory. Night comes softly. The sky deepens from gold to violet, the first stars trembling into view. Somewhere, an owl calls. The wind carries the faint smell of pine resin and soil. A candle flickers near the monument, one light among thousands lit in other lands, in other languages, all bound to the same promise. And that promise is this: never again, not as slogan, but as vow. Not whispered out of fear, but spoken with calm defiance. Never again will silence be mistaken for peace. Never again will indifference hide behind ignorance. Never again will humanity look away. The eternal silence of Treblinka is not meant to lull us into forgetfulness. It is meant to awaken us, to remind us that the capacity for cruelty and compassion lives side by side in every heart, that the line between them is drawn each day by choice, and that memory, fragile, painful, luminous memory, is what keeps that line visible. In the years to come, the survivors will all be gone. The guardians will pass their keys to others. The trees will grow taller, the stones will weather, and new generations will arrive with questions their ancestors could not have imagined. And when they stand here, they will not see horror. They will see endurance, the endurance of truth, of memory, of conscience. Perhaps they will close their eyes and hear what the survivors once said. We rose because we refused to die without being human. Those words, carried on the wind, will outlive every monument. Because monuments crumble, but courage does not. When dawn returns to Treblinka, the field gleams with dew, the grass bends under the light, glistening like tears that belong to no one and everyone. Birdsong fills the air where once there was silence. Life, in all its quiet persistence, continues. And that is the final truth of Treblinka. The camp that tried to vanish did not. It survives in testimony, in soil, in the moral pulse of humanity. It stands as a reminder that even the deepest silence can be transformed into a voice that warns, teaches, forgives, and endures. So when you walk away from this place, whether in body or in memory, carry its silence with you. Let it guide you when the world grows loud with cruelty. Let it remind you that remembrance is not the past's demand, but the future's defense. For as long as someone remembers Treblinka, the silence will never truly be still. It will hum beneath the surface of human thought, a low, eternal chord of conscience. It will whisper to every age the same timeless truth, that life is sacred, that memory is justice, and that even here, where the world once ended, the soul of humanity began again. And so, from the ashes of Treblinka rises not despair, but remembrance. This place, once built to erase lives, now endures to protect them, a warning carved in silence, a heartbeat beneath the soil. If you have listened, truly listened, then you carry its memory now. Every choice, every kindness, every moment of empathy becomes its answer to cruelty. For silence is no longer emptiness, it is a promise. A promise that the world will remember, and that even in the quietest corners of history, humanity will speak again. You are watching Lullaby of Empires, where history speaks. Between July 1942 and October 1943, in a quiet corner of occupied Poland, nearly 900,000 people were murdered in less than 16 months. Their names came from across Europe, from Warsaw, Vienna, Prague, Thessaloniki, and Berlin. Most never spent more than 2 hours alive inside the place that killed them. That place was Treblinka, one of the most efficient killing centers of the Nazi regime. It was not a camp of imprisonment or labor. It was a factory of death, built for one purpose: extermination. No long rows of barracks, no watchtowers filled with prisoners' cries, only a deceptive train station, fake ticket counters, and a path lined with flowers leading straight into gas chambers disguised as showers. Treblinka was part of Operation Reinhard, the plan to annihilate the Jewish population of occupied Poland. In this single small clearing, humanity reached one of its darkest calculations: how to murder on an industrial scale, without witnesses and without trace. When the killing stopped, the SS dismantled the entire site. They tore down every building, plowed over the mass graves, planted crops, and built a farmhouse in its place. By early 1944, Treblinka had vanished, or so they thought. Today, there is no barbed wire here, no smoke, no ruins, only quiet fields and the whisper of wind over grass. But beneath that silence lies the memory of nearly 1 million lives, and the story of those who refused to let the truth die with them. This is not just the history of a camp, it is the story of erasure and remembrance, of how humanity's attempt to bury its crime only made the ground itself remember. This is Treblinka. Blueprints of annihilation. In the winter of 1941, while snow fell softly over the German countryside, a series of meetings began to take shape that would alter the meaning of civilization itself. Germany's war still burned across Europe, yet in quiet offices, away from the thunder of artillery, men gathered around polished tables with papers and pencils in hand. They spoke of populations, transports, and quotas. Their words were sterile, administrative, yet beneath them lay a purpose that would darken history. The idea of extermination had been whispered before, but never planned. By January 1942, at a villa on Berlin's Wannsee Lake, those whispers became policy. 15 officials, representing every branch of the Nazi state, convened to coordinate what they called the final solution of the Jewish question. There were no raised voices, no oaths or blood seals. Only calm discussion. Who would be deported, which territories were cleansed, how much railway capacity would be required. Behind the bureaucratic language was the quiet certainty that the annihilation of millions could be organized as a logistical project. Operation Reinhard was born from that room. Named after Reinhard Heydrich, the SS architect of terror, it would become the central mechanism for the murder of Polish Jewry. 3 sites were chosen: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Each would exist not as concentration camps but as factories of death, places designed with a single function and no survivors. Unlike Auschwitz, which blended labor and killing, the Reinhard camps were pure efficiency. Victims would arrive, be processed, and be gone within hours. The blueprints came together not in secret castles but in ordinary offices. Civil engineers from Lublin, carpenters, railway planners, even local contractors were summoned. They were told only that the camps would handle resettlement. Some may have suspected the truth. Others preferred not to ask. The design brief was deceptively simple. The site must be close to a railway spur, hidden from main roads, surrounded by woods, and easy to build with local materials. It needed unloading ramps, a reception square, storage for confiscated goods, and chambers sealed enough to contain gas. Treblinka met every criterion. A small railway station already existed near the village, its isolation ideal. When the surveyors arrived, they noted the gentle rise of land and the density of the surrounding forest, a place where sound could die before reaching the nearest farmhouse. Construction began in the spring of 1942 under SS supervision, with local laborers paid in cigarettes and vodka. Few understood what they were building: a line of wooden barracks, a fenced-off laundry, a strange building with thick concrete walls and exhaust pipes leading from buried engines. By July 1942, Treblinka was ready. Its opening coincided with the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. The first trains rolled in carrying thousands. From the moment the wagons stopped, the design proved flawless in its cruelty. The platform was disguised as a transit station, complete with a clock painted on the wall and a sign reading Obermajdanek, transfer. The illusion of order calmed the new arrivals just long enough. Then came the separation, the stripping, the forced march down the fenced corridor the guards called the road to heaven. Within hours, silence returned and another train approached. Every detail of the camp was calibrated to maximize throughput. The layout formed a mechanical rhythm: arrival, disrobing, extermination, disposal. Diesel engines salvaged from captured Soviet tanks pumped their exhaust into sealed chambers built of brick and cement. Nearby, pits gaped in the earth, where bodies were buried in layers until the soil heaved. Even the watchtowers were positioned with mathematical precision, ensuring no blind spot where a prisoner might vanish. It was the architecture of annihilation, function without conscience. And yet, Treblinka was not merely a structure of walls and wires. It was a machine powered by people. About 25-30 SS men oversaw operations, assisted by roughly 90 Ukrainian guards trained at Treblinka. Their commandant, Irmfried Eberl, was a doctor from the Nazi euthanasia program, someone who had already learned how to kill by paperwork. Under him, the first months descended into chaos. Trains arrived faster than the camp could consume their human cargo. Bodies piled high, decomposing in the heat. The stench carried for miles. Villagers whispered of a place where the air itself had turned sweet and foul. In August 1942, Eberl was replaced by Franz Stangl, a man whose calm demeanor masked an engineer's obsession with order. He streamlined the process, widening the railway siding, expanding the chambers, and enforcing discipline among the guards. Under his rule, Treblinka achieved its horrific peak efficiency, up to 10,000 people a day. The deportation lists flowed from Warsaw, Białystok, Radom, and beyond. Entire towns vanished between sunrise and sunset. At first, Stangl saw himself as an administrator fulfilling a duty. Years later, in interviews before his trial, he would describe Treblinka as a perfectly functioning machine. To him, the murders were abstractions, movements of trains, tallies of wagons, schedules maintained. But beneath the machinery, fragments of humanity endured. Prisoners forced into labor formed secret networks. They memorized routines, smuggled scraps of food, whispered news from incoming transports. In the midst of a system built to erase identity, memory became rebellion. The camp's design reflected the Nazi mind at its most paradoxical, meticulous and delusional, combining modern engineering with medieval cruelty. The SS demanded that even the appearance of civility be maintained. Flowers were planted along paths leading to the gas chambers. A fake Red Cross flag fluttered near the so-called infirmary, a pit where the sick and wounded were shot. Deception was part of the architecture. The prisoners understood this better than anyone. They learned that beauty here was a warning. By late 1942, the machinery strained under its own success. Graves overflowed. Disease spread among the burial squads. The earth could no longer absorb the weight of death. Orders came from Berlin to exhume and burn the bodies, Sonderaction 1005. The program to erase evidence of mass murder. In Treblinka, pits were reopened and bones dragged to open-air cremation grids made of railway rails. Flames rose day and night, painting the horizon orange. Ash drifted through the forest and settled on leaves like gray snow. Villagers miles away saw the glow and did not speak of it. In this phase, Treblinka began to consume itself. The same organization that had built it now sought to erase its traces, but memory does not obey commands. The workers forced to burn the bodies counted the days, studied the guards' routines, and began to plan. Whispers of revolt spread from the sorting yards to the workshops. They watched which keys opened, which doors, which guards drank too heavily, which rifles were left unattended. Treblinka had been designed to allow no resistance, yet within its geometry, a flaw existed: human will. The blueprint of annihilation had always carried its opposite, the possibility of defiance. For every calculation meant to end life, there remained a pulse of survival. Beneath the monotony of transports and executions, a dangerous hope began to form. Prisoners dreamed of setting the camp ablaze, of escaping into the forests that ringed the horizon. The idea was madness, but so was everything around them. And so the plans continued, hidden in murmurs, etched in memory rather than paper. From an outside view, Treblinka was invisible. Allied reconnaissance never photographed it. German reports referred only to transit operations. Even many within the SS hierarchy did not know its full purpose. Its secrecy was its strength and its eventual weakness. Because the camp left so few survivors, the men who built it believed it would vanish without trace. But the earth remembers. Every shovel that turned its soil became part of a record written without ink. By early 1943, the war itself was shifting. News of German defeats in Stalingrad filtered even to the remotest posts. Among the guards, confidence faltered. Among the prisoners, whispers turned to plans. They knew they would soon be killed to conceal the evidence. The only path to survival lay through fire. Treblinka's architecture had been drawn for murder, not for war, but now it would face both. Before the uprising, before the fires, there was still the ordinary routine. The trains, the counting, the false smiles. The SS men still drank their coffee on the platform as smoke rose from the pits. They still filled out forms, sending their neat reports to Lublin and Berlin. Paperwork flowed even as blood dried on the ground. Bureaucracy was the final mask of evil, the illusion that murder could be managed. The blueprints that birthed Treblinka were drawn by human hands. They used rulers, compasses, and ink. Somewhere in those lines, in the measured spaces and labeled rooms, the unimaginable was made ordinary. A few millimeters on paper equaled thousands of lives. That was the genius and the damnation of the system. It transformed morality into geometry. When the last surveyor packed his tools and left the site in 1942, he could not have imagined that decades later, archaeologists would trace his foundations not with pride, but with sorrow. Beneath the weeds and the silent stones, the outline of Treblinka remains, a testament to what happens when precision serves cruelty. Every rail, every brick, every false flower was a note in the symphony of destruction that Europe would spend generations trying to comprehend. As the first chapter of this story closes, the camp stands completed, gleaming in the cruel order of its newness. The fences are taut, the gates aligned, the engines tested. The men in uniform walk its perimeter with satisfaction. They have built what they believe to be perfection. Yet within those fences, unseen and unrecorded, the future rebellion already stirs. The blueprints of annihilation have been drawn, but so too, unknowingly, have the blueprints of resistance. Trains of silence. By midsummer 1942, the air above the Polish plains shimmered with heat and the rumble of engines. Across the occupied territories, railway yards filled with the sound of coupling chains and whistles. Station masters checked their ledgers, SS officers their lists, and in the ghettos the word transport took on a new and dreadful meaning. It was no longer a rumor, it had become a timetable. From Warsaw, Białystok, Radom, and Lublin, sealed freight cars stood waiting on the sidings. Each bore the familiar insignia of the Reichsbahn, Germany's state railway, once a symbol of modernity, now repurposed as the arteries of death. Conductors logged the routes with bureaucratic precision. Departure time, number of wagons, estimated arrival at Treblinka first. The forms looked identical to those that carried coal or grain. Only the cargo had changed. Inside the ghettos, notices were posted on walls already covered in propaganda. Families were ordered to assemble with 20 kilograms of belongings and food for 3 days. They were told they were being resettled for labor in the East. Few believed it, yet the illusion persisted because hope was easier to bear than the unknown. Mothers packed blankets, fathers carried prayer books or family photographs, children clutched toys that would never reach another sunrise. At dawn, columns formed in the narrow streets, the shuffle of feet echoing between walls scarred with bullet holes. German police and local auxiliaries herded the people toward the waiting trains. The elderly and sick fell behind. Shots cracked without pause. The rest stumbled on, driven by the shouting of guards and the barking of dogs. When the station gates opened, they saw the boxcars, wooden cattle wagons, small square windows barred with wire, one bucket for water, another for waste. A number was chalked on each door. Order amid chaos. At 10 a.m., on 22 July 1942, the first major transport left Warsaw. 60 wagons, more than 6,000 souls. The train's logbook described its content simply as special resettlement. It passed through villages where farmers paused their work to watch, uncertain, while children waved at the ghostly procession. The shutters of the wagons hid the truth, but sometimes a hand appeared between the slats, reaching for air or for mercy. None came. For the passengers, time lost all measure. The air grew hot and foul. Thirst clawed at their throats. In darkness they whispered prayers, sang fragments of psalms, comforted the children until even whispers faded. Some scribbled notes on scraps of paper and pushed them through the cracks. "We are being taken to Treblinka. Remember us." Many of those messages were found along the tracks after the war, half erased by rain, the ink blurred but the plea unmistakable. The trains moved slowly. They waited on sidings for hours, while military convoys passed. Conductors sometimes opened the doors briefly to check the cargo counting, not helping. A few bribed guards for a bucket of water. Most were indifferent. For them, it was another assignment in a war of endless orders. The rhythm of the wheels became a dirge, the steel rails stretching toward oblivion. At the same moment, in offices hundreds of kilometers away, the machinery that sustained these journeys ticked flawlessly. In Lublin, Odilo Globoknik, head of Operation Reinhard, reviewed the reports from the camps. Efficiency charts listed the daily arrivals: Warsaw 6000, Radom 4500, Białystok 3200. Each number represented a trainload of human beings compressed into statistics. The language of genocide was arithmetic. Railway dispatchers received bonuses for maintaining punctual schedules. The Reichsbahn charged the SS for third-class fares, children under 10 at half price. Payment was deducted from confiscated Jewish property, ensuring that even death generated profit. In Berlin, accountants balanced the ledgers. Not one entry was left blank. A genocide maintained by bureaucracy, fueled by timetables and invoices. Meanwhile, in the countryside, villagers learned to recognize the pattern. First, the distant whistle, then the rumble, then the smell and odor of sweat and despair that lingered long after the train had passed. Cows stopped grazing, dogs barked at the rails. Some locals crossed themselves, others turned away. The trains became part of the landscape, like storms that came without warning but always from the same direction. For those trapped within, the journey often lasted 2 or 3 days. In midsummer heat, oxygen dwindled. People fainted and fell. The living were forced to stand on the dead. When the train stopped for switching, there was no sound except the creak of metal and the soft murmur of prayer. Occasionally, a guard would open a door to fire into the car, silencing cries. Then the doors slammed shut again, sealing the darkness. At Treblinka, the railway spur curved gently through pine forest before ending at a low wooden platform. The line had been extended deliberately so that passengers could not see what awaited beyond the bend. As the first wagons rolled in, SS men in clean uniforms appeared, shouting orders rehearsed to perfection. Some carried riding crops, others rifles. Ukrainian guards blew whistles, dogs lunged on chains. The arrivals were told they would be disinfected and registered for work. Women and children to one side, men to the other. The deception was total. The platform scenes repeated endlessly that summer. Every hour, another train arrived. Every hour, the same cycle unfolded. The screams of one convoy faded as the next came into view. For the prisoners assigned to unload the trains, the repetition was unbearable. They learned to work quickly, silently, ignoring the faces that mirrored their own. When the wagons were emptied, the doors were thrown open to reveal the chaos inside. Bodies tangled, air thick with heat and horror. Workers dragged the dead aside, scrubbed the floors, sprinkled lime, and prepared for the next transport. The system left no pause for grief. By August, Treblinka's capacity had become legendary within the SS. Heinrich Himmler himself inspected the operation and demanded greater speed. Special trains were rerouted from other districts. Even Auschwitz envied the efficiency. The camp could process a convoy in under 2 hours from arrival to disposal. The phrase "train of silence" became an unofficial code among railway staff, a sardonic nod to the secrecy surrounding these movements. They carried no mail, no freight receipts, no passengers who would ever return. In the ghettos still awaiting liquidation, the rumors of Treblinka grew. Some escaped from earlier transports, leaping from moving wagons at night, returning with stories too terrible to believe. They spoke of a camp with no barracks, no labor force, only chimneys and pits. Few wanted to listen. Denial offered comfort. The transports continued. Even hope, it seemed, could be scheduled. The Germans perfected the deception. At major stations, posters displayed idyllic scenes of resettlement. New homes in the east, fertile farms, smiling workers. Prisoners were told to label their luggage carefully so it could be returned later. This instruction served a dual purpose. It kept them calm and sorted their possessions for plunder.